The large bright hall of the clinic was brightly lit. It was spacious and cozy. A young dark-haired girl was sitting on one of the sofas. It was Ningxi. There was a slight smile on her face, and her eyes seemed to be looking inward. She carefully covered her stomach with her hands. Suddenly, the girl shuddered. Someone put a hand on her shoulder. Waking up from her thoughts, she heard someone calling her. Turning around, she saw that it was a nurse. She was breathing heavily, as if she had been running for a long time. The girl asked her what had happened. The nurse handed her the forgotten test forms. She also informed her that Dr. Zhang had asked her to come to him for a checkup next week. Ningxi assured her that she would definitely come. Stepping outside, she closed her eyes happily. Now she was happy with absolutely everything. But most of all, she was pleased that Yan was returning today. Ningxi wondered if Yan would be happy about the news of her pregnancy. After all, this was their first child. She herself was extremely happy about it. The girl walked down the street looking around joyfully. The sun was shining brightly and the trees rustled with lush green crowns. She had already reached the edge of the road when she suddenly heard a sharp noise. It was the roar of a powerful car engine. Ningxi saw a red sports car approaching her at high speed. She froze in fear. The brakes squealed sharply. But the car didn't have time to stop. Ningxi screamed in fear and instinctively covered her stomach with her hands. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable blow. But then there was silence. When she opened her eyes, she saw that the car had stopped right in front of her. The door opened and a charming, slender foot in a velvet slipper stepped onto the road. It belonged to a tall, pretty girl. Her hair was an amazing platinum color. The girl adjusted her hair and frowned with displeasure. She was very beautiful, and would undoubtedly have attracted attention if not for the displeased expression on her face. Ningxi saw who was in front of her and froze in surprise. It was her sister Shui Luo. Ning said that she was crazy for acting like that. However, Shui Luo just laughed. She asked Ningxi if she was afraid that Shui Luo would knock her down and kill her child. Ningxi then clasped her hands tighter on her stomach, angrily saying that Shui Luo had crossed the line and was simply behaving inappropriately. Ningxi's brown eyes were angry and threatening. She was like a wild cat and very angry. However, Shui Luo was not at a loss. She moved towards Ningxi menacingly and replied that she was the one who had crossed all boundaries. Seeing the blank look, Shui Luo contemptuously explained that being pregnant by an unknown person and declaring Yan to be the father was very shameless. Ningxi was completely taken aback by this statement. With her eyes widened in horror, she asked what kind of nonsense Shui Luo was talking about. In response, she condescendingly said that Ningxi apparently had no memory of who she was with that night. Shui Luo added that it was very funny to see how Ningxi couldn't figure out who was with her. And when she wanted to ask again, Shui Luo told her the truth. That night, she had put something in Ningxi's wine. That was why she had entered the wrong room later. Ningxi screamed in confusion that it was all a lie. She said that she clearly saw Yan next to her when she woke up. But Shui Luo explained to her that Yan only did it because he was very kind. And now it seems she is carrying someone else's child. Then Ningxi completely lost control. She grabbed Shui Luo's shoulders and shook her. Ningxi kept asking why she treated her like that. But Shui Luo fiercely resisted. She did not feel guilty about anything at all. She only replied that Ningxi should understand everything herself. She screamed that Ningxi was being such a bitch. As she said this, she also grabbed Ningxi's shoulders so hard that even the thin fabric of her blouse cracked. And then something happened. Shui Luo suddenly stopped. Ningxi froze in surprise, and Shui Luo suddenly began to apologize. She looked at Ningxi with tearful eyes and called her little sister. Then she started saying that Ningxi could yell and even hit her if she wanted. She only asked not to blame Yan for anything. And Ningxi couldn't understand what was going on. She only managed to notice Shui Luo's satisfied grin. However, Ningxi still didn't understand anything. Suddenly, in the next moment, Shui Luo fell hard onto the asphalt. At the same time, she cried out pitifully. But Ningxi did not touch her. Shui Luo lay on the ground, pitifully curled up, begging for forgiveness, while Ningxi muttered her name in amazement. She had absolutely no idea what was going on, and she kept asking Shui Luo what she was doing. But there was no answer. Then Ningxi suddenly noticed someone. A tall, slender young man was slowly approaching them. His face was gloomy. Ningxi's eyes widened in surprise. It was her beloved Su Yan. She was very happy to see him. The girl joyfully rushed to him. Her face lit up with a happy smile. She cheerfully said that he had finally returned. However, the young man suddenly walked past her and moved on. Ningxi froze in amazement. This was completely unexpected. She stood there, not moving from her spot. And Su Yan was already leaning over Shui Luo. He was telling her that he had returned, and asking her how she was feeling with concern. He looked at her and asked with pain in his voice if she was hurt. And Shui Luo had already pressed herself against his chest and said that she was wrong. She even cried. Wiping away her tears, Shui Luo said that she was to blame. She repeated that she had offended Ningxi. Su Yan calmed her down and asked her not to cry. Shui Luo, sobbing, repeated that she didn't think it would happen like this and didn't want it. He asked her to calm down and get into the car. In the end, Su Yan said that he would explain everything to Ningxi himself. After Shui Luo left, he finally turned to Shi and looked at her. The girl stood there looking at him in confusion, and Su Yan slowly said her name and asked him to forgive her. After a short silence, he finally said quietly that he couldn't marry her. Ningxi stood in front of him, staring at him with wide eyes. She was so surprised that she couldn't even say a word. The girl was completely shocked because something happened that she had never expected. And Su Yan slowly continued to say that all this did not happen because of her. And not because of what happened that night. He just did not want to lie to anyone anymore and let Shui Luo down. Ningxi listened to him in complete confusion and horror. She realized that her beloved Su Yan had fallen out of love with her. Moreover, something completely unbelievable happened. He fell in love with Luo. And now he even protected her, completely ignoring Ningxi and her pregnancy. Then she realized something. Ningxi asked Su Yan if he knew from the beginning that Shui Luo had put something in her wine. After all, she had destroyed Ningxi's honor. To her horror and bewilderment, he said that Shui Luo had not wanted any of this. According to him, it all happened because she was still too young and impulsive. Ningxi then asked painfully, "What about her?" She wanted to know if Su Yan thought about her even a little bit. Then Su Yan said that the sun was too bright outside. He suggested that they go into the car and talk there. The young man even extended his hand to her, but suddenly Ningxi began to push his hands away in anger and slap them, screaming at him not to touch her. The girl was breathing heavily and crying. Through her tears, she said that only now did she realize that everything she did for Su Yan was a big stupidity. She remembered studying day and night until she was exhausted. All this was just to get into the university. And of course, for Su Yan, she also gave up her dream of becoming an actress for him. After all, he didn't want her to act. So Ningxi turned down the role. And for his sake, she even offended her dear adoptive parents. That's when she returned to the Ning family to her biological parents. Ningxi wanted to be a worthy match for Su Yan so much. That's why she steadfastly endured all the reproaches from the Ning family. And now, wiping away her tears, she thought about what she had gotten in the end. She had devoted almost her entire life to matching Su Yan. And now all she heard was that he couldn't leave Shui Luo. It was this girl sitting in the scarlet sports car now. That was the source of all her troubles. Ningxi knew that Shui Luo had not only stolen and destroyed her identity, she had also deprived Ningxi of her parents' love. And now Shui Luo had even taken Su Yan away from her. Of course, she was still young and deserved leniency. But who could take care of Ningxi herself in that case? Thinking about all this, Ningxi slowly walked away from Su Yan. Now she was at the very edge of the sidewalk. The youth ordered her to move away because it was already dangerous there. He even reached out to her, wanting to stop her. But suddenly someone grabbed his hand tightly. Yan stopped. Turning around, he saw Shui Luo. It was she who was holding his hand and looking imploringly with her huge blue eyes straight at him. Then he took her by the shoulders and asked why she got out of the car. After all, he had asked her to wait for him there. Then a loud thud reached them. Shui Luo and Su Yan turned around in alarm. Luo was still clinging to his chest, and Yan was gently hugging her shoulders. And then they saw Ningxi lying on the ground. There was a large car parked right in front of her. Apparently, the girl had stepped onto the road before the car had stopped. Someone started screaming and asking for an ambulance. They had to hurry because a pregnant woman had been hit, and Ningxi was barely moving on the asphalt. She was in a lot of pain. Shui Luo and Su Yan leaned over her in concern, asking if she was okay. Luo was frightened and begged her to wake up quickly. Ningxi opened her eyes with difficulty. Everything was swimming in front of her. She was breathing heavily. The girl was lying on the asphalt, pressing her hands to her stomach. She was very pale, and there were drops of blood around her. 5 years passed. The large bar room was brightly lit. Cheerful, well-dressed young men and women were sitting at the tables. Loud, upbeat music was playing. but the corridor was quiet and empty. And then one of the doors opened, splashing out lively chords. A girl came out into the corridor. It was Ningxi, but now it was quite difficult to recognize her. She leaned against the wall, exhausted, and took several deep breaths. The slight dizziness she was feeling was completely out of place right now. Suddenly, a serious young blonde with glasses, Zhang, appeared in front of her. She asked Ningxi if it was true that she had signed up to audition for the lead female role in the film Tianxia. And when the girl confirmed, the blonde suddenly became terribly angry. She screamed that she would not allow this. But Ningxi asked again in surprise. Her huge brown eyes filled with confusion and surprise. To this, Zhang responded that doing it secretly was extremely unwise. The company had already arranged an audition for the lead role for Shui Luo, and then it all became clear to the dark-haired beauty. She realized that Shui Luo had sent Zhang to find her and prevent her from auditioning. Apparently, she was afraid that the role would go away. Zhang was still angry. She said that the Ning family had already invested about 30 million in the production of the film. Therefore, Shui Luo would definitely get the role. To this, Ningxi replied that in this case, Zhang and the whole family definitely shouldn't worry. And Zhang reminded her that she was her manager, and demanded that she listen to her words. To this, Ningxi slightly sarcastically remarked that Zhang had suddenly remembered that she was patronizing her. But she still did not understand how her signing up for the audition could harm her. Then suddenly Zhang calmed down and said that she didn't want to waste time arguing. It was strange, but Ningxi didn't want to continue the quarrel either. She turned her back to Zhang and thought about it. That's why she couldn't see that Zhang's face was distorted with anger and her fists were clenched. Zhang hissed through her teeth that if Ningxi wanted it to be the bad way, then she simply had no choice. Her eyes narrowed. The next moment, Ningxi felt a strong push on her back. She was so surprised that she lost her balance and flew forward. Not even a second had passed before she was lying on the floor in some closet. It was a staff room. The blow was so strong that Ningxi couldn't even get up right away. Zhang immediately jumped back and slammed the door. She turned the handle so that it couldn't be opened from the inside and sighed contentedly. The girl thought that Ningxi deserved all this for wanting to cross Shui Luo, so she said that it served her right and walked away down the hallway, throwing Ningxi's phone on the floor. And she finally managed to sit up, leaning against some box. She needed to recover from the fall. The girl thought about how Shui Luo had been more reserved immediately after her return. However, it seemed that Shui Luo had not changed at all in the past 5 years. Ningxi sat down and hugged her knees. She felt very sorry for herself. She thought about what would happen if she did not get this role. Then it seemed like she would have to leave the acting agency, and she didn't want that at all. Ningxi frantically tried to think of a way out of this situation, and then suddenly she heard a suspicious rustling sound in the silence. It came from the corner of the closet, where there were quite a few large cardboard boxes. At first, Ningxi thought it was just mice scratching in the corner behind the wall. But then one of the boxes fell on its side and seemed to roll away. Ningxi shuddered in fear. She watched the box with widened eyes, but nothing else happened. Then the girl stood up and came closer. She asked who was rustling there and asked him to show himself to her quickly. When Ningxi carefully moved the fallen box, she saw a dark-haired head and a small body behind a pile of others. It was shaking violently. She looked closer, and suddenly 2 huge bright blue eyes looked at her. They belonged to a cute little boy who was sitting trembling on the floor. Ningxi realized that it was only the adorable little boy who had scared her. So she squatted down and gently asked him who he was and how he had gotten to such a strange place. But the baby didn't answer, just looked at her with fear and anger. Ningxi guessed that someone had accidentally locked him in this closet. The situation was strange, but the baby looked so cute that the girl almost calmed down and even began to smile at him. As if she remembered something, she began to rummage through the pockets of her light yellow light raincoat. Finally, she found what she was looking for and offered the little boy a candy. For a moment, the thought crept into her head that the child might be mute, since he had not uttered a sound the entire time. But the girl decided not to think about it for now. After all, she herself was locked in the utility room at that moment, and couldn't even free herself. Therefore, she should have thought first of all about herself and her salvation. And then suddenly, one of the fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling began to buzz, and sparks began to fly out. It looked like there was a short circuit. Following this, Ningxi heard strange clicking sounds. Turning around, she noticed that it was the boy's teeth chattering in fear. She guessed that he was afraid of the dark. Ningxi walked over and sat down on the floor next to him. The little boy looked at her with huge, frightened eyes, and the girl suddenly felt a strong headache. This was not surprising at all. After all, she had to spend a lot of time in the bar with investors. Ningxi leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. It gave her a little relief. She didn't even notice that she had dozed off. But suddenly she felt the baby grab the edge of her cloak. Ningxi shook off her sleep with difficulty and opened her eyes. She noticed with surprise that the baby was now sitting very close to her. He even leaned against her thigh and seemed to have already fallen asleep. Ningxi reached out and gently stroked his head. The child's hair was soft and gentle, and he smelled nice. She thought he looked like a gentle kitten. This comparison was so touching that even her eyes became moist. Ningxi quietly whispered that the baby should not be afraid, because she could not harm him. She continued to stroke his head, when suddenly the child opened his eyes and looked at her. Ningxi accidentally touched his forehead and suddenly felt that he was quite hot. This puzzled her. It seemed that the baby had a fever. Ningxi became worried. She knew that if the temperature of such a small child was not brought down, it could be dangerous. She began to frantically think about how to get out of the trap. Ningxi turned her head from side to side, but she did not see anything that could help. Her eyes filled with tears. She felt so helpless and trapped right now, and she really wanted to help the baby. And then suddenly she noticed a small square window on the wall, almost under the ceiling. Of course, it was too small for an adult, but not for a child. Ningxi stroked the baby again and asked him to wait a little and not to be afraid. He looked at her trustingly, and she started rummaging between the boxes. And then she was unexpectedly very lucky. The girl found a rather strong ladder. Ningxi picked her up and dragged her to the wall with the window. She leaned the ladder against the edge of the window and saw that it was just the right height. It was an unexpected stroke of luck. The girl made sure that the ladder was quite stable and called the baby. She wanted to try something, but the child did not move. He shifted from one foot to the other hesitantly, but seemed afraid and did not understand what Ningxi wanted from him. Then she came up to him again and squatted down. The girl said that she would help him, but the baby only shook his head from side to side. He was a little scared, but he still looked very touching and funny. It even made Ningxi laugh a little. The girl looked him straight in the eye and began to explain. She said that she wanted to do everything herself, but the window was too small, so he would have to crawl through and call for help. The baby understood what she wanted from him, but he still hesitated and could not decide to climb the ladder. Ningxi sighed. She felt a little awkward that she, an adult girl, had to ask a child for help. After all, she was the one who should be helping him. But there was no way out. Then she picked up the baby and put him on the step of the stairs. Ningxi said that although he was small, he was a man and should not doubt. She held him and told him that he shouldn't be afraid. By keeping the baby safe, she felt responsible for him and believed that he would succeed. But he still began to slowly climb up the steps. When the child was almost at the top, he suddenly looked back and looked at Ningxi again. And now he was standing on the very top step. Ningxi couldn't even reach his feet. Only now did she feel how much her head hurt. The deafening pain seemed to cover her with a terrible black dome, under which even sounds could not penetrate. Her eyes began to close. Suddenly, Ningxi felt like she was about to faint. There was nothing she could do about it anymore. With the remnants of her consciousness, she managed to think that perhaps the baby would still be able to call for help. This was their only chance, and she was already lying on the floor among the boxes, exhausted. The baby had already reached the windowsill and was now looking at her with fear. It seemed that he was panicking and thinking about going back to the floor, but Ningxi still opened her eyes and looked at him. She suddenly thought that if she hadn't lost the child back then, he would have been exactly the same age. With her last strength, she whispered to the baby to get out. Ningxi wanted to be free and take revenge too much. After all, she was no longer the same naive girl she used to be. Meanwhile, panic reigned in one of the VIP rooms of the restaurant. A tall young man in a dark suit was sitting on a sofa by the wall. Several other young men stood in front of him, guiltily. One of them bowed sheepishly and said haltingly that they had already searched the entire bar. His whole appearance spoke of a feeling of deep guilt and anxiety. Two more guards and a young woman in a formal suit also bowed. They said in unison that none of them had been able to find the little gentleman. A tall, fair-haired boy rushed towards the silent man. He was in tears and lamenting that it was all his own fault, because he should not have taken the child to the bar with him. To this, the man everyone called Xiaolu said gloomily that it was indeed a big mistake. After all, who would think of taking a little kid to a bar? He looked askance at the boy who was his brother. Xiao Lu's black eyes lit up with an evil fire. Suddenly, he kicked the guy who was bending over in front of him. The toe of his boot hit him right in the jaw. The blow was so unexpected and strong that he flew to the opposite wall and stopped only when he bumped into it. Xiao Lu continued to look at him angrily, and the guy didn't even seem to notice his fall. He continued to burst into tears and insist that if something happened to the child, he wouldn't survive. Then Xiao Lu stood up and walked towards him. Stopping right in front of the guy, he sullenly said that he said it himself. And everyone around knew that this was not a joke at all. The other subordinates stood with their heads bowed low. Each of them thought that if the boss kicked his brother so easily, then they might get into trouble too. And then, in the silence that followed, strange sounds were heard. Everyone listened. It sounded like someone was knocking faintly on the door. One of the guards approached the door and turned the handle. At first it seemed to everyone that there was no one behind the door. But then a small dark-haired head appeared in the crack. Finally the door swung open. Standing on the threshold was the same little boy whom Ningxi had helped out of the pantry through the window. Everyone in the room stared at him in amazement. It seemed no one expected the precious loss to show up on its own. The blonde boy was the first to rush to the child and grab him in his arms. He covered him with kisses and called him his little treasure. Still in tears, he screamed, calling the child his precious child. No one could understand where the baby could have been before this, and his father and uncle almost had a heart attack. The other subordinates also couldn't hold back their tears. Everyone was incredibly happy that the child had been found and was okay. And everyone thought about what would have happened if everything had been different. The irresponsible uncle continued to squeeze the child. But then a strong hand grabbed him by the collar of his jacket. The next minute, he was already flying to the side, thrown aside by Xiao Lu, who leaned over the child and picked him up. The father asked the little boy what had happened to him. But he was silent, only constantly breaking free and pointing to the door. Then Xiao Lu finally guessed to ask what the child wanted to show him. He realized that he needed to go somewhere. The little boy nodded and began to point his finger at the exit. Following his instructions, a minute later everyone was standing in front of the door of the staff closet. The guard tugged at the door, but it was locked. There was no sound from inside. The baby, seeing this, began to break free and wriggle out of Xiao Lu's hands. He slapped his father's hands with his palms as if asking him to let him go. He was afraid that he would simply drop the child and put him on the floor. The baby immediately jerked away and ran to the door. Then Xiao Lu angrily turned to the female manager. He asked why she was still standing there and not opening the pantry. And she was frightened and muttering something incomprehensible. Here her boss demanded the key to the closet from her in a categorical tone. The girl began to rummage through her pockets in confusion and finally pulled out a small yellow key. She thought about how Zhang had paid her to keep Ningxi locked up until the next night. But now, in front of such important guests, she simply couldn't object. The girl inserted the key into the lock and turned it. Pressing the handle, she hesitantly opened the door. Through the resulting gap, the silhouette of a lying man was visible. When the door swung open, everyone saw a girl in a beige raincoat lying on the floor. She was unconscious and barely breathing. Xiao Lu and his subordinates looked at her in shock. No one could understand what had happened and how the young girl had ended up locked in a dark storage room. The boss asked the manager in a demanding tone how this woman had gotten here. The girl answered in confusion that she herself knew nothing and did not understand anything. But the prisoner had to be helped as soon as possible. But then something completely unexpected happened. As soon as they tried to enter the closet, the little boy slipped between their legs. He ran in first and stopped in front of the lying girl. He spread his arms, covering her with himself, and looked forward menacingly. It was as if he was trying to protect Ningxi and not allow anyone to approach her. Everyone looked at him in amazement. No one expected such courage and bravery from a sweet little boy. The restaurant owner turned around and looked at Xiao Lu. He was completely taken aback by the appearance of the stranger and could not figure out how to act in this situation. Meanwhile, Xiao Lu noticed the manager girl's embarrassment and fear very well. He looked at her sideways and saw that she looked too guilty. And then the restaurant owner noticed something unusual. In the far dark corner of the closet, he saw a ladder standing by the open window. He decided to call Xiao Lu and draw his attention to this small detail. He silently looked at the path to freedom that saved the lives of his son and the unknown girl. Xiao Lu noticed every little detail. He noticed that the window was too small for an adult, and that it was located quite high under the ceiling. Finally, he broke the silence. In a dry and reserved tone that did not bode well, he ordered everyone to leave. Xiao Lu already understood very well what had happened here and intended to sort it all out. After saying this, he walked up to the girl who still showed no signs of life. Xiao Lu carefully picked her up and hugged her. Carrying the girl in his arms, he moved towards the exit. His face still showed nothing, but all those close to him understood that the investigation would be long. Everyone around him, his fair-haired brother, the guards, and the female manager, looked at their important and stern master in amazement. Now he seemed to have opened up to them from an unexpected side. Suddenly, Xiao Lu felt as if someone had grabbed his pant leg. He turned around and saw his son looking at him from below, worried. Xiao Lu looked at him and saw that the boy was afraid of something. Then he calmly told the little boy that he would not harm the girl. He explained that he would simply take her to the hospital. He said she needed help and the baby simply couldn't carry her, so he had to do it himself. Finally, a clear and sunny morning arrived. Fluffy clouds slowly floated across the sky above the large, bright building of the city hospital. It was quiet in the spacious and bright ward. A light breeze silently swayed the thin, translucent curtains on the window. The girl lying in bed finally opened her eyes. She looked around in surprise, not understanding where she was. She still felt weak, so she didn't even try to get up. Ningxi gradually recalled the events of the past day and came to her senses. And then suddenly she noticed a serious look directed at her. The girl opened her eyes in surprise. She did not expect to see a stranger near her bed. But it was not a dream. There was indeed a handsome dark-haired man sitting quite confidently on a chair next to her bed. He was slightly disheveled, but that didn't spoil him at all. Then Ningxi suddenly remembered something. She sat up in bed and tried to get up. She was very worried. Then Xiao Lu, and it was he, looked at her questioningly. And Ningxi was confused and asked if he had seen a child nearby, a boy of 4 or 5 years old. She also added that the baby was absolutely wonderful and cute, just adorable. Xiao Lu frowned in confusion, and Ningxi was starting to worry. Now she no longer thought about her own condition. She was only worried about the fate of the child she had last seen at the top of the stairs. Then he finally realized who the girl was talking about. It seemed that the girl was talking about his son and heir, the same little boy she had found in the cramped closet. But when he asked again, Ningxi didn't understand at first. She couldn't even imagine that the cute little boy who was cuddled up to her like a kitten could be the son of this serious man. And then suddenly she turned her head and saw a sleeping child on the next bed. This was the same baby. Now he was fast asleep, but the IV needle was visible in his hand. Ningxi calmed down a little. It was obvious that the baby was fine now. He even looked quite healthy. However, she still touched his forehead carefully so as not to wake him up. Ningxi was happy to see that the fever had gone and the temperature had dropped to normal. She then turned back to Xiao Lu and asked who he meant by the heir. She wanted to make sure that she was dealing with the baby's real father. The man nodded in agreement and said that they looked alike. Only then did Ningxi notice that their faces were indeed very similar. It was strange that she hadn't realized before that they were father and son. And then suddenly a blonde whirlwind rushed into the room. A young, attractive guy leaned over Ningxi and looked straight at her with amazing turquoise eyes. He greeted the girl and said that he was the good-for-nothing uncle of the little treasure she had found. And she couldn't believe that Lu Jingli was standing in front of her. After all, Lu Jingzi was the second son of the owner of the largest company, Lu Shi. He appeared on television and in newspapers more often than many celebrities, so it was easy to recognize him. But then Ningxi began to connect the dots. If the tall stranger on duty in her room was the baby's father, and his uncle was Lu Jingli, then it was something unbelievable. It turned out that the man who sat by her bed and waited for her to wake up was incredibly rich. After all, he was the legendary god of wealth, Lu Tingxiao. As soon as these words left her lips, the man nodded in agreement. He said that everything was indeed so, and asked what her demands were. Ningxi's eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't understand what this legendary man was talking about, even though they spoke the same language. But then the blonde Lu Jingli came to the rescue. He explained to the bewildered girl what his brother meant. She had saved the baby, and for that Xiao Lu was ready to give her whatever she wanted. Realizing this, Ningxi shook her head. She said that they didn't have to thank her at all. After all, if the little boy hadn't called for help, she wouldn't have been able to get out. The girl believed that no one owed her anything, because these people saved her. Xiao Lu listened to her, frowning with displeasure, but remained silent. He continued to stare at her with an angry expression, and Ningxi couldn't understand why he was so unhappy and what was going on. His face looked simply frightening. Even Lu Jingli noticed that his brother's expression did not look too friendly. He asked Xiao Lu not to look at the girl so threateningly, and he also suggested that she think carefully and tell the boss what she wanted. He, like no one else, knew that his brother disliked being in debt to someone more than anything else. But Ningxi was already starting to be a little afraid of the formidable financial genius, so she sheepishly said that she had done nothing special, and it could be easily verified. Suddenly, Xiao Lu broke the silence and said that there was no need for verification. His brother and Ningxi looked at him in confusion. The girl felt very awkward and did not understand what the tycoon was talking about. She turned to Lu Jingli and asked what was going on and what his brother was talking about. Then the young man explained to her that they had already watched the recording from the surveillance cameras in and around the storage room. No one had any doubts that it was she who had saved the boss's son. That's why he once suggested that Ningxi ask the financier for something. The girl sighed resignedly. It was hard for her to imagine that someone was forcing her to ask for something against her will, but it seemed she had no other choice. Then Ningxi hesitated a bit, and hesitantly said that she had thought of something. She suggested to the big boss that he just give her some money. At that moment, the girl thought that this request would look quite normal. But suddenly, to her horror, she noticed that his eyes were burning with anger. It seemed that he would now flare up with anger like a fire. Ningxi no longer understood anything. She again turned to her blonde brother, asking him to explain to her what she had done wrong. He hesitated a little, but answered. In his opinion, Xiao Lu thought that simply giving money was insulting. After all, it would mean that he could value the child's life with a certain amount. But Ningxi was already quite tired of this difficult situation. She resolutely said that it was completely unimportant to her, and that she could easily survive such an insult. However, Lu Jingli still gently suggested that she think of something else, and the girl was already in despair. There was not a single, even the most unusual wish in her head, and then suddenly Xiao Lu said something that made her think she had misheard. He had asked Ningxi to marry him, and it seemed he was quite serious. The girl and Lu Jingli looked at him dumbfoundedly. Each of them had completely different thoughts in their heads. Ningxi thought that she had drunk too much alcohol and was now hallucinating. She cleared her throat and took a deep breath. Mentally saying goodbye to life, the girl asked to repeat what the big boss had just said, and he repeated his proposal just as reservedly and coldly. After all, it wasn't a hallucination. He really did ask her to marry him. Ningxi froze with her mouth open. She heard him too well now, but that didn't make her feel any better. Seeking salvation, she turned to Lu Jingli again and asked him what all this meant. And he himself had already asked Xiao Lu what he meant and how to understand it all. But he remained sullenly silent, and Lu Jingli had no choice but to tell Ningxi that she had heard everything correctly. Then the girl decided to ask again. She asked if Xiao Lu was really proposing to her just because she saved his son. And to her horror, he calmly confirmed it. Then Ningxi fell to her knees in fear. Her legs wouldn't support her. She was sure that she had injured her head and was hallucinating. She climbed onto the bed with difficulty and asked Lu Jingli to help her in a weak voice. Calling a doctor seemed like the best solution for her. She even coughed impatiently. But he stood motionless. The young man himself was quite shocked by the development of the situation, so he was in no hurry to fulfill Ningxi's request. Then the girl stood up and walked towards Xiao Lu. She stood right in front of him and said that she couldn't accept his proposal. Ningxi said that she wouldn't marry him for anything in the world, and he only briefly asked why. But Lu Jingli also asked her the reason for the refusal. After all, his brother was considered the most eligible bachelor of the modern era. This statement took Ningxi by surprise. She had never even thought of such a thing. Therefore, she couldn't come up with a convincing reason right away. Then she said something that caused confusion on the brothers' faces. Ningxi asked if the financial genius Xiao Lu was gay. There was a puzzled silence in the room for a few seconds. Then suddenly, Lu Jingli burst into infectious laughter. He laughed so loudly that tears even flowed from his eyes. And Xiao Lu, hearing this suggestion, turned red with anger. His eyes were flashing lightning, so much so that his brother even had to cover his mouth with his hand to hold back his laughter. After laughing and wiping away his tears, he asked Ningxi where such ridiculous thoughts came from. After all, if it were true, and Xiao Lu was gay, then where would the child come from? But Ningxi just shrugged. In the modern world, there were many ways to get an heir. It could be surrogacy or artificial insemination. Then Lu Jingli slyly asked her why his brother would propose to her in that case. And the girl replied that it might be possible precisely to hide this fact. And after that, she was silent for a while and said in a mysterious tone that she had heard something else. There was cunning and a little bit of guile in her eyes. And then the two brothers stared at her with wide eyes. The younger one was waiting with interest for a new version, and the older one suspected that he would hear some unpleasant gossip. Then Ningxi said that she heard that the two of them were not just brothers. They had even been together for a while. This caused Xiao Lu to get angry again, and Lu Zhongli even fell to his knees in fear. For a while, both of them stared at her in silence. The brothers' faces showed genuine surprise. Seeing this, Ningxi realized that the rumors were probably false after all. Finally, Lu Jingli was the first to pull himself together. He cleared his throat and said that he had heard many different rumors, but this rumor surpassed them all. He added with a smug smile that he considered himself quite attractive, and he fully admitted that he could be liked by both men and women, but he still preferred women. He wanted to say something else, but suddenly glanced at Ningxi and his brother. At this time, his brother was leaning over the girl with a threatening look. Lu asked in surprise what he was doing. Without turning around, Xiao Lu asked his brother to take the baby out somewhere. His tone was strange enough that Lu even decided to ask what was going on. And then Xiao Lu suddenly said that he wanted to prove something to Ningxi, and it was clearly about his sexual orientation. The girl, hearing this, froze in shock. She could only look at him with her eyes wide open in amazement. But all the words seemed to have disappeared somewhere. She raised her hands and tried to push the man away. But he didn't back down. Then Ningxi said that she was just repeating one of the rumors, and added that there was no need to thank her anymore. Backing away from the financier, she said that if he was so insistent that she ask for something, then she did have one wish. And she said that she asked him to leave her alone. In the end, the girl even slightly pushed Xiao Lu away and apologized, adding that she had to go to a very important casting. She pretended to be terribly afraid of being late. Finally, Ningxi waved her hand slightly and quietly said that fate would decide everything. She believed that if this meeting was destined, it would definitely happen. The girl hurriedly headed for the exit, when suddenly she was stopped by the boss's commanding voice. He said that he did not allow her to leave just like that. Ningxi froze in place and turned around with a guilty expression. She asked in a barely audible voice what else this strange man wanted from her. And he just handed her a pen and a notebook and said that it would be nice to leave a note for his son. That way the child wouldn't worry when he woke up and didn't find her there. Ningxi let out a sigh of relief and grabbed a pen. She quickly wrote a few lines in her notebook, pleased by the insignificance of the request. The girl wrote that she was very grateful to the baby for not being afraid to save her. Finally, she added that she hugged and kissed him and happily finished the note. Ningxi hurriedly handed the notebook to Xiao Lu and rushed to the exit before he decided to stop her again. At the door, she said goodbye and asked him not to see her off. Finally, the door slammed shut behind her, and Xiao Lu was still standing there, holding a notebook with a note in his hands, looking thoughtfully after her. He was clutching a piece of paper in his hand and seemed to be thinking about something. His face clearly showed a lively interest, and then Lu jumped up to him again. He started to circle around his brother, trying to look into the notebook and bombarding him with questions. The young man admiringly said that his brother clearly liked this girl. He hadn't seen his brother show such interest in him for so long that he himself began to suspect him of being gay. At this point, Xiao Lu couldn't take it anymore and asked his brother to shut up. Meanwhile, the taxi that Ningxi was riding in suddenly stopped at the entrance of a huge high-rise building. The parking lot in front of it was already filled with many cars and people. The girl opened the door and literally jumped out of the car. She was already very late, so she almost ran, breathing heavily. Pushing her way through the crowd, she counted the minutes of her delay, and each of them filled her heart with the pain of loss. Finally, Ningxi rushed into the spacious hall and saw a beaming Shui Luo coming out to greet her. There were cheers and clicks of cameras all around. Now the sister came very close and stopped in front of Ningxi. She looked at her, sullenly and stubbornly tilting her head, and Shui Luo moved on easily. And only on the move did she say that Ningxi was an insignificant bug, and could not compete with the shining moon. This nickname suited Shui Luo well due to her unusual platinum-colored hair. But Ningxi was not going to give in so easily. As she walked on, she quietly said that one day everything would change. She was going to remember absolutely everything, and one day show her sister who was truly worthless. The girl understood that she was definitely late. However, she decided to try to get to the casting. And then she suddenly saw the crew members coming out from the back of the room. They were laughing and chatting happily, discussing how Shui Luo had brought the character to life so well. Ningxi boldly rushed to intercept them, apologizing for being late and asking them to give her a chance. However, one of the men, the most unfriendly and strict, stopped her abruptly. He said that the audition was already over and she had come in vain. Looking at the girl with displeasure, he added that one could expect less and less reliability and punctuality from young people. Ningxi listened to him with her head down sadly. And then Ningxi suddenly came up with something, and it was truly a brilliant idea. The girl even smiled cheerfully. She looked boldly at the important people standing in front of her, on whom her fate depended, and she said that she had not come to get the leading role. Everyone stopped in surprise and looked at her questioningly. The female assistant asked what role Ningxi was applying for then. And then the heroine replied that she would like to get the secondary role of the general's girlfriend, who became a fatal beauty, Meng Zhang. The same stern and dissatisfied man, the chief director, looked at her thoughtfully. He nodded his head and asked Ningxi to introduce herself. The girl looked straight at him, trying to put all her charm into her gaze, and said her name. It was worth noting that she really did look like the named character. And then the man suddenly smiled broadly. He said that he agreed and now the secondary role belongs to her. He also promised that the heroine would be notified about the start of filming. Ningxi beamed. She looked at the crew members with such delighted eyes that they couldn't help but smile. The girl bowed politely and thanked the director. She promised to prepare well so as not to disappoint him in his choice. When the happy heroine left, the director still continued to watch her. He thought that the search for the secondary heroine would take a long time, but it unexpectedly did not require any effort. Then a female assistant told him from behind that she had found Ningxi's data. And then it turned out that she was also an actress, like her sister Shui Luo. This had simply been overlooked before. The director nodded thoughtfully, and the assistant was joyfully excited. She said that the girl's look was exactly what was needed for her character Meng Zhang. After all, the character needed to be seductive, but not vulgar. And all the previous candidates portrayed her as a cheap whore, which greatly upset the group. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in the huge city hospital. The room that Ningxi had just left was filled with dull thuds. The baby, who had recently been so quiet, sweet, and calm, was now very angry. He sat on the windowsill of a high window and did not respond to the staff's requests. Doctors and nurses gathered in the important patient's room and tried to persuade him to come down. And then suddenly the child's uncle, Lu Zhongli, appeared. He reassured the young female doctor and suggested that she try to talk to the child. He was very persuasive, so she did not object. The young man stretched out his arms to the boy and began to persuade him to come down. He tenderly offered the child to quickly embrace his beloved uncle and came closer and closer. Suddenly, the baby waved his hand several times. There was a sharp sound and blood sprayed into the air. Lu Zhongli screamed and turned away from the child, holding his face in his hands. The little boy sat on the windowsill like a furious little kitten. His sharp nails had just scratched his uncle's face until it bled. And now he was wailing, rocking back and forth, bemoaning his beauty, until he bumped into someone. An angry Xiao Lu stood before him, asking what was going on. His brother, in tears, explained that the heir had woken up and was looking for the rescued girl. According to him, when the child was told that the girl was no longer there, he simply lost his head and went crazy. And now the child was sitting on the window and refused to go down to anyone. Xiao Lu sighed heavily and walked to the window. He looked at the boy and calmly asked him to come down. The father explained that the child had simply misunderstood his uncle. The girl had simply left the hospital and had not died. The brother listened to him in amazement and understood that the child had made up something unnecessary. And Xiao Lu continued to soothingly tell the child that the rescued girl was okay. She left in good health. The little boy listened to him thoughtfully. Then the man remembered his last trump card. He took out the note left by Ningxi from his pocket and showed it to the boy. The father explained to the child what it was, and the boy became interested. Xiao Lu held the paper in plain sight and told the little boy that he would receive the note if he only climbed down from the windowsill. The little boy reached out to his father, fascinated. And Lu Jingli was suffering from resentment behind his brother's back. He was angry that he had spent half a day trying to persuade the boy in various ways. And it was all useless until the note appeared. Meanwhile, Xiao Lu had already picked up his son and was holding him tightly. As promised, he gave the child a note, which he quickly grabbed and unfolded. The little boy looked at a simple piece of paper. Ningxi had written there that she thanked him for saving her and called him a good boy. At the end, she even drew a kiss and her face. The boy clutched a piece of paper from his notebook in his hands, and a happy smile blossomed on his face. Now he didn't resemble the enraged kitten that had torn his uncle's face apart not long ago. And Lu Jingli was surprised to see him smiling and drew everyone's attention to it. According to him, the little boy hadn't smiled for a long time, and no one remembered when it happened. The young man leaned over the boy and asked him in a confidential tone to see what was written on the note. But he frowned and turned away, covering the sheet with his body. The boy ran to the side and quickly put the note in his pocket. He obviously did not want to show it to anyone. It was a hard blow for his uncle. The young man's eyes filled with tears of pain and disappointment. He lamented that for the little boy his own uncle was less important than an unknown beautiful girl who had just appeared in his life. A little later, in a cozy apartment on the outskirts of the city, a cheerful song was heard. A young girl was humming happily, preparing herself a simple dinner. She lived in a large apartment complex that was now, at sunset, filled with people returning from work. Most of the windows in the building were already brightly lit, and every apartment was bustling with life. There was a small saucepan on a compact electric stove. A bright red liquid was bubbling merrily in it, from the depths of which appetizing pieces of fish occasionally floated up. Ningxi was absolutely happy now. She picked up a piece of fish with her chopsticks and took it out of the pot. The food looked very tempting and smelled delicious. The girl carefully blew on the hot piece and put it in her mouth. It was her first time preparing this dish and she was not yet familiar with all the subtleties. However, after chewing, Ningxi realized that the dinner was a success. It was incredibly delicious. For a moment, the smile slipped from her face. The girl suddenly thought that the one who ate hot, delicious ramen noodles alone really did not have any close friends. She was about to take her second bite when suddenly there was an insistent knock on the door. Ningxi first thought that someone had made a mistake. But a voice came from behind the door. The girl approached the door cautiously and took hold of the handle. She wasn't sure if she should open it. After all, it was already quite late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Ningxi finally opened the door and froze in amazement. She stood at the threshold looking at the visitors and could not believe her eyes. Xiao Lu stood behind the door, holding a baby in his arms. And the baby was clutching a basket of fluffy, warm buns, tied with a beautiful bow. The girl asked hesitantly how they knew the address. The man replied that it was a courtesy call. He and his son had simply decided to visit the sick woman. This sounded very strange. So Ningxi asked sarcastically who would look for sick people with buns late at night. To this, Xiao Lu calmly asked why it was not allowed. The heroine was embarrassed. She finally noticed the child's surprised look and realized that she was behaving a little strangely. Besides, the baby's father scared her a little, so it was easier not to object. Then the man asked her why the hostess did not invite the guests in. He was obviously surprised by her inhospitable reception, so Ningxi had no choice but to let them in. She was embarrassed, but stepped aside, letting the guests in. Only now did the girl notice that she was dressed completely at home, and the apartment was not ready for a visit from anyone. So she began to rush about, putting away unnecessary things and hastily apologizing for the mess. The father and son watched her calmly. Finally, the girl brought some simple comfort and order and invited them to sit down on the sofa. She tried not to meet the man's gaze, as for some reason it embarrassed her. The father and son sat down on the sofa and froze in awkward positions. It seemed that they too felt the awkwardness of the moment. Then Ningxi offered them milk or tea. When the guests agreed, the girl ran to the kitchen with relief. There she took a deep breath and tried to calm down. She succeeded so well that when she brought the tray into the room a minute later, the glasses did not even shake. But inside, Ningxi was tense, like a taut string. Turning her back to the guests for a moment, the girl thought that this visit was not quite opportune. She had expected to spend this evening alone. Then Ningxi suddenly remembered the dinner she had prepared. After all, she hadn't had time to eat yet, and the aromas were still in the air. Then, a little embarrassed, the girl offered the guests dinner. She said that it was the first time she had cooked ramen noodles and was ready to share it with the father and son. It seemed a little strange, and she didn't quite expect to get consent. However, Xiaolu agreed, and the little boy also raised his hand in agreement. Ningxi arranged the plates of snacks around the pot of noodles that was still bubbling happily on the stove. The table was quite modest but very appetizing. Suddenly, Ningxi realized that she hadn't asked the main question. She liked spicy food, so she made ramen with a lot of spices. But strangely enough, the guests agreed. The girl was not sure that small children like spicy food. However, the baby agreed without hesitation. And now the father and son were sitting at the table, enjoying the spicy noodles with pieces of fish. And Ningxi was still trying to figure out why they had come to her that evening. Finally, the girl decided to eat a little herself. She took a bowl and poured herself some broth with noodles. And then suddenly, Xiaolu reached out and took a piece of fish out of the pot with chopsticks. Before she could blink, he had already dropped that big and juicy piece of fish onto her plate. It looked strange but touching, and Ningxi thanked the man shyly. Seeing the appetite with which the baby was eating rather spicy noodles, the girl asked if it was harmful for such a small boy. But the father replied that the child was not growing up as a softie at all. The girl thought that she herself would try to feed the little boy a little differently, but it was not her child, so she only nodded in agreement. Then, after a brief silence, Xiaolu spoke again. He asked Ningxi how her audition for the role went. The girl smiled. She was a little pleased that he remembered the reason for her sudden, quick departure and now asked about the result. She answered that everything went well and the role was obtained. Then Xiaolu suddenly raised his glass and congratulated her on her success. Ningxi raised her surprised eyes to him, expecting a trick or mockery, but the man was completely serious. And Ning suddenly thought how strange her life and career were. She really wanted to become famous and successful, but she never thought that the first person to congratulate her would be a financial genius. She thanked him quietly, blushing slightly with embarrassment. But he remained silent, as if he was thinking about something. But after a moment, Xiaolu looked at her again with interest. He offered her a drink and asked why she decided to become an actress. The girl simply replied that she was interested in trying herself in this profession. She had no intention of dedicating her plans to a barely familiar person. They clinked their glasses together. It was all so strange and unexpected. This evening was supposed to be another quiet, lonely dinner for Ningxi, but it turned out completely differently. And now she sat with a glass in her hand opposite the youngest and most famous businessman in the country. Nin thought about what kind of evening she would like more, and she didn't know the answer. However, she still thanked Xiaolu once again for his visit and congratulations, and he looked at her carefully, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Then Ning suddenly wanted to tell him something nice, and she thanked him for saving her with his son. After all, it was only thanks to this that she was able to get to the audition. Nin held her glass in her hand as she spoke to the man. Suddenly she noticed that the baby was staring at him. Then he looked at his milk glass. There was a cute kitten painted on it. To be honest, Ningxi had specifically chosen this one because the baby reminded her of a kitten too. Suddenly he took it in both hands, lifted it and reached for Nin's glass, looking at her questioningly. She smiled and said it was very nice that he wanted to drink with her. The child clinked his glass against hers and began to drink with an air of importance. The girl looked at him with affection. He seemed absolutely stunning to her. She was absorbed in watching the child when suddenly a strange sound was heard. At first, no one understood what it was, but then everyone noticed that it was Xiaolu's phone vibrating. He apologized and said he would step away for a while. The man wanted to answer the call without being disturbed. For some reason, it was already difficult for him to pull himself together in front of Ningxi. Meanwhile, the girl noticed that the baby was studying the contents of her glass with great interest. She asked him if he wanted to try it. He nodded in agreement. Then the heroine looked around playfully, and seeing that Xiaolu was not nearby, handed the glass to the little boy. But she only allowed him to take one sip. It was a light wine with a very pleasant fruity aroma, so the little boy took a sip with pleasure. He obviously expected it to be very tasty. However, he grimaced and closed his eyes, feeling the sharp taste. Ning laughed and noted that this is why children drink milk. The boy, looking at her, also began to laugh cheerfully. This is how they were when Xiaolu returned. Seeing how happy his very unusual son was, he also smiled warmly and thought about something. However, soon he suggested continuing the dinner. A few minutes later, the cutlery was empty. No one noticed how it happened, but the guests and the hostess ate everything to the last crumb. Ning leaned back in her chair with satisfaction. She could rightfully consider her first experience of cooking dinner a success. The empty plates clearly showed it. The baby had already laid his head on the table and was beginning to doze, and his father was leisurely continuing to sip wine from his glass. Nin wondered if they were going home, but it didn't look like it. Then the girl dared to ask directly. She said that it was already quite late and hinted that it was time to go home. However, Xiao Lu suddenly said no. Looking straight at her, he suddenly said that it was not time for them to go home. Ning was puzzled. She didn't quite know what to do next. And the man added that the weather forecast promised a serious storm and even a typhoon for the night. The girl, hearing this, became worried. She babbled that it must be very dangerous to get home in such weather. However, she did not understand at all what to do. She looked at the father and son with bewilderment, and they sat opposite her and waited for some decision. Then Ning, embarrassed and stammering, said that the storm and typhoon were very serious things, so she asked the guests if they wanted to stay the night. And then the girl clearly saw how similar they were. The baby and his father had exactly the same offended expression on their faces, and the father asked how she could even think of throwing them out. Then Ningxi suddenly thought that something strange was going on. She was starting to feel that Xiao Lu was up to something and had some plans for her. He had agreed to stay the night too easily. However, it was time to decide on a place to sleep. Ningxi suggested that Xiao Lu sleep on the bed with the boy. She herself was going to sleep on the sofa. However, the man refused. He said that it would be better if he himself lay down on the sofa, and the girl would lie down with baby Xiao Bao. Ningxi was tired of arguing with him and chose to agree. Now she had to find beds for the guests and some clothes for the night. Rummaging through her closet for things, she tried to understand what was happening to her lately. How did it happen that the president of the largest company in the country was staying with her overnight? Then she saw a funny yellow pajama with a Pikachu face. The girl remembered that she had bought it quite a long time ago, when she was much smaller. It might suit the baby. Now she kept telling herself that she simply had to offer them a place to stay for the night. After all, driving in the dark in bad weather was really quite dangerous. Ningxi was still rummaging through the things in the closet when suddenly there was a soft knock on the door. It was Xiao Lu asking for permission to enter. He opened the door and now stood on the threshold of her bedroom, hesitating to enter. The girl suggested that he wear her brother's t-shirt for the night. She pulled it out of the pile of things with difficulty and handed it to the man, and he stood in front of her, looking at her carefully. Ning looked very cute in pink pajamas with funny yellow ducks. There was nothing provocative or even flirtatious about these clothes. However, he still had a hard time keeping himself in check, not understanding what was happening. Ningxi took the baby to her room and was about to go to bed. She asked Xiao Lu to call her without hesitation when needed. He turned away with a strange expression on his face that seemed displeased to the girl, and went into the living room. She closed the bedroom door behind him, puzzled. Turning around, she saw that little Xiao Bao had already changed his clothes, and was now sitting on the bed like a real Pikachu. His yellow ears were hanging down to the sides, and he was incredibly cute. Ningxi was simply enchanted by him. She had liked this cute and gentle child before, and now he even seemed like her own, and her pajamas suited him incredibly well. The girl climbed under the blanket and stroked the baby's head. She suggested that he move closer and fall asleep. However, he seemed to have no desire to close his eyes. Xiao Bao looked around the room and everything in it with interest. Ningxi remembered everything she knew about little children. It seemed that he should have fallen asleep long ago. But time passed, and the child did not fall asleep. Then the girl suggested telling him a story or a fairy tale. She understood that she had never had experience communicating with such small children, so it would not be easy. At first, she tried to remember the story of the little prince, but quickly got confused. Then she began to sing a song, the words of which popped into her head. However, Nin had to stop before one of the lines that spoke of a love affair. She suddenly realized that this song was clearly not intended for children. She sheepishly pretended to have forgotten the words and began another song about a little frog. It was a rather strange song that Nin made up as she went along. However, after a few minutes, the baby's eyes closed and a soft, sweet snore could be heard. Ningxi realized that the baby had finally fallen asleep. She fell silent, and now just quietly looked at the sleeping boy, resting her cheek on her hand. She liked this sweet little boy more and more, and she was very pleased that he had become so attached to her. She thought about what must have happened to his mother, that she was not with him now. Not having thought of anything, Nin turned off the light and went to bed. However, in the middle of the night she was awakened by a sudden roar. The girl turned on the lamp and tried to understand what had happened. It seemed that the sound was coming from the living room where Xiao Lu was sleeping. Ning jumped out of bed and walked into the living room. When she entered, she saw Xiao Lu holding a glass of water in his hand. He was holding his stomach and didn't look very healthy. The girl asked if he was okay, although it was obvious that he was not. However, the man answered dryly that everything was fine. But by the hand pressed to his stomach, Nin already understood that his stomach hurt. He stared at her in surprise, not understanding where such insight came from. And Nin thought that men were sometimes surprisingly stupid. She turned and went to get the medicine cabinet. She only asked him to wait a little while she found some medicine for her stomach. Ningxi came back very quickly. A few minutes later, she was already handing Xiao Lu 2 pills and promised that they would definitely help. Apparently, the man was not feeling well at all, because he immediately drank the medicine without the slightest objection. Ning, embarrassed, said that she did not know that he was not allowed spicy food, but for some reason the financier didn't like it at all. Frowning, he replied that everything was fine and there was no need to worry. Although he didn't look healthy at all, he insisted that Ning return to the room. He thought that little Xiao Bao might wake up and get scared without her. The girl asked him why he was so sure that this child needed her. It seemed to her that he was simply looking for someone to attach himself to in order to receive care. But Xiao Lu explained to her that the baby was very scared when he was locked in the warehouse, and she found him and helped him get free. So the boy is now very dependent on her attention. Ningxi thought that all this happened by chance. She didn't attach much importance to the fact that she ended up in that closet. However, having gained a little courage, she finally decided to ask about something that had interested her since she first met the baby. She wanted to know if the child could speak. Hearing the direct question, Xiao Lu's expression darkened. With sadness in his voice, he said that he didn't want to talk about this topic. And then Nin realized that her assumptions and observations were correct. It seemed that the reason for the child's silence was some kind of psychological trauma. Lost in thought, she didn't immediately notice that the man was standing very close and looking at her carefully. It seemed he was trying to remember something. When she looked up at him with surprised eyes, Xiao Lu decided to ask her anyway. He said that her face seemed strangely familiar to him, but he couldn't remember where they had met. Ningxi was even amused by his suggestion. She replied that their meeting was unlikely. After all, he was too famous, rich and famous. Hearing this, the man even opened his mouth in surprise. His cheeks slightly blushed from embarrassment, which Ning immediately noticed. Taking advantage of his embarrassment, the girl quickly said that if he was already feeling well, then she should go to bed. The evening had dragged on quite a bit. However, Xiao Lu had already sat down on the sofa. Looking at her, he asked Ning to take her time and sit with him for a while. She sat down on the edge of the sofa, surprised, away from the guest. The atmosphere in the room was so tense that even the air seemed thick and still. Xiao Lu glanced at her and saw Ningxi sitting there, staring straight ahead with her eyes fixed. He asked her why she was so afraid of him. The girl began to object unconvincingly. She babbled that she was not afraid at all, but just a little nervous. But it sounded very unconvincing. Then the man said, offended, that many were afraid of him. But he didn't think that she would be afraid too. And he added that many women would like to marry him. So he wondered why Ning had so decisively refused when he proposed marriage to her. The girl had jumped up and was now standing before him, trembling with excitement. She said that she would explain everything to him. But first she wanted to ask one question, the answer to which interested her very much. At this point, Xiao Lu patted the sofa next to him, motioning for her to sit down again. But Ning noticed that the closer she was to him, the harder it was for her to think clearly. She still asked the man why he wanted to marry her. She thought that the proposal was made only because little Xiao Bao was so attached to her. The answer was silence. Then the girl said that his affection was most likely temporary and would soon pass. Therefore, there was no need for an offer. So no one should be offended. Xiao Lu listened to her in silence, his face expressionless. But then he said that he had decided everything for himself at the very beginning. According to him, he was so attracted to Ning that marriage was the only way out. Hearing this, the girl smiled slyly. She said meaningfully that she was quite free, so there were no obstacles to attraction yet. Xiao Lu didn't like this very much. He asked sharply if he understood correctly that the heroine could sleep with him, but did not want to become his wife. It sounded quite clear and firm, But in essence, this was exactly what Ningxi wanted to say. She had never thought about marriage before. However, judging by the stern expression on his face, this was not what her guest wanted. He said he was sorry, but relationships outside of marriage were unacceptable to him. After a short silence, Xiao Lu suddenly said that little Xiao Bao was an illegitimate child, and his father did not know who his mother was. It was very strange for Ningxi to hear this. According to him, the mother abandoned the baby when he was still a baby, and now he has only his father and his numerous relatives, but no mother. Ning was shocked. She said that any mother would be happy to have a son like Xiao Bao. To this, Xiao Lu immediately quickly asked why she did not want to be his mother then. Ning held her head. She was already quite tired from the tension caused by the sudden guests, and the fact that Xiao Lu was right next to her. He didn't miss a single word she said. The girl collected her thoughts and said sternly that she took marriage very seriously, and their meeting had happened quite recently, so he could not possibly know anything about her past. But the man was not interested in all this at all. He said that he wanted to marry her now, and that meant that everything that had happened before had no meaning for him. However, Ning was not used to living without looking back, and the past meant too much to her. So she asked Xiao Lu to take back his proposal and forget about it. She looked at the man standing in front of her with some sadness. Everything could have been different under different circumstances. But it was strange that after her refusal he did not look angry. Now they just looked at each other in silence. It seemed like some kind of duel between two characters. And so Xiao Lu was the first to pull away and sit down on the sofa again. He crossed his arms and calmly said that he would wait. And Ningxi resolutely replied that she was going to bed. She wished him good night, turned around and walked out of the room. Xiao Lu watched her go silently. Suddenly, he also wished her good night, barely audibly, and added even more quietly that he had not yet given up. In the morning, the girl was awakened by the quiet buzzing of Xiao Lu's phone. It was on vibration mode, but she still heard it and walked out of the bedroom, rubbing her eyes. And then her unexpected guest from yesterday appeared before her. Only today he no longer looked so strict and prim. The reason was the complete absence of a shirt and a strangely defenseless appearance. He asked if he had woken her up. Ningxi said no, and she thought with annoyance that he had settled into her home so quickly that he considered it acceptable to walk around half naked. She turned away in embarrassment. When she looked at him again, he was already putting on his jacket. Xiao Lu said that the company needed his presence and asked him to wake up his son. The girl nodded in agreement and turned to follow the baby. She thought with relief that soon she would finally be alone. And then they saw that little Xiao Bao was already standing in front of them in cute yellow pajamas. His face was gloomy and dissatisfied. It seemed like he didn't want to leave this house at all. His father asked him to go and get dressed. They should have hurried. But no one could have imagined that the boy would resist leaving so much. Little Xiao Bao went into the bedroom and slammed the door behind him very loudly. Ningxi and Xiao Lu looked at him in silence and amazement. After coming to his senses, the man tried to open the door, but the boy locked himself in from the inside. Xiao Lu asked if there was a key to the door. There was, but it was inside the room. This made the situation very difficult. The father began to pull the handle and knock with all his might, demanding that they open the door. He threatened his son that they would never come to this house again if he did not open it. Ning tried to stop him, saying that the landlord would charge her if anything was broken. But Xiao Lu just shrugged condescendingly. It was nothing to him. Minutes passed and the door remained locked. No sound came from behind it. Father was already furious, but he could do nothing. Nin tried to say that the boy could stay in her apartment if he wanted to so much. But the man was already very angry and was going to call a psychiatrist. Then the girl coughed quietly to get his attention. She asked permission to try to talk to the child herself. The father reluctantly agreed. Then Ning came closer to the door and said that she had to go to work, so she would not be able to spend the day with the boy. She asked him to go home with his father for now. The baby didn't answer, but she didn't give up. Nin suggested that they exchange mobile phone numbers so they could stay in touch at any time. She explained that being late could get her boss to reprimand her, so she promised to call little Xiao Bao as soon as she was free. Finally, the lock clicked, the handle turned, and the door opened. A boy in Pikachu pajamas stood on the threshold, looking at Ningxi with loving eyes. She had done it. Sometime later, in a posh apartment on the other side of town, producer Zhang was talking to Shui Luo, a platinum-haired beauty. She broke some bad news. Somehow she heard rumors that Ningxi had actually spoken to the lead director and had been cast as the second lead. Shui Luo was surprised and dissatisfied. Zhang said with annoyance that Ning was lucky. After all, the producer asked the restaurant manager to lock Ningxi in the storage room until the end of the audition, but she managed to escape. Shui Luo flipped through the script and found that Ningxi's role was second only to hers. This movie was a very serious project, and Shui Luo was very unhappy with the news. However, Zhang quickly reassured her. According to her, Luo's company had invested quite a lot of money in the filming, so it could dictate some conditions. She advised Shui Luo not to think about the bad, and she suddenly laughed. Shui Luo thought that Ningxi had been cast as a cruel and selfish woman who robbed her husband, and such a role would hardly help the actress's reputation. And on the set, passions were already running high. They were filming a scene of a quarrel between several men and Ningxi's heroine. The characters accused the girl of being a witch and intended to kill her. Ningxi looked great in makeup and national costume. She resisted desperately, putting all her skill and talent into every movement. Her lines were precise and correct. However, this was not enough. The actors playing the samurai roles desperately overacted and looked unnatural and strange. The director was very unhappy. He shouted that the actors' movements were terrible and called them all inexperienced blockheads. Filming continued for a long time but was still unsuccessful. The scenes did not work out, and the actors were acting more and more out of tune. Finally, a break was called and Ningxi was able to return to her dressing room. She happily kicked off her shoes and stretched out on the couch. They had been filming for 5 minutes of the film for over 2 hours. After taking a short rest, she decided to turn on the TV and watch the news. She couldn't shake the thought that she had forgotten to do something. The announcer on the screen said that the Lu Corporation had become a partner of the Italian brand DR and was entering the European market. This could lead to a significant increase in the company's shares. Hearing the name of the corporation, Lu, Ningxi remembered that she had promised to call little Xiao Bao, Xiao Lu's son. Perhaps the little one had been waiting for her call all day. She grabbed the phone and started dialing the number. The girl mentally scolded herself for forgetfulness because she almost broke her promise. The mobile phone rang in the spacious mansion belonging to the Lu family. At this hour, the entire family was gathered around the table for dinner. The owner of this house, Xiao Lu's mother, was worried as she looked at little Xiao Bao. He was sitting at the table with everyone else, but he was not eating anything and was constantly holding his mobile phone. And Lu Jingli explained to her that the baby was fine. He was just waiting for a call from a beautiful young woman. The mother became worried. It was the first time she had heard about the appearance of someone foreign, not belonging to the family, in the baby's life. And Jingli, smiling slyly, said that he had seen this beauty, and supposedly she was his elder brother's lover. Hearing this, Xiao Lu frowned with displeasure, and the parents were simply amazed. The mother cried out joyfully, not believing her happiness, and the father demanded to tell the whole truth without concealment. Jingli replied that he had no intention of lying and was telling the truth. Offended by the mistrust, he suggested that his parents ask Xiao Lu directly. They immediately pounced on Xiao Lu with questions. The mother suggested that he had finally proposed to baby Xiao Bao's mother by finding her. But Xiao Lu rejected this suggestion. But the mother was still happy. She even said carelessly that she was very happy that Xiao Lu still preferred girls over boys. This caused Jingli to burst into fits of loud laughter. He added that Xiao Lu really seemed to be in love, and that the girl was really very beautiful. It was at this very moment that the phone rang. The little boy stared at the screen with huge eyes, and Zhang Li began to hurry him to accept the call. After all, it was the same beauty they had just talked about, Ningxi, who was calling. Little Xiao Bao pressed the button and put the phone to his ear. He was already smiling, and the whole family looked at him with affection. Ningxi's voice came through the receiver. At first, she apologized for calling during dinner, but the girl explained that she had just gotten free and was calling right away. She asked if the baby had eaten well, and she said that he simply needed it to become strong. She also said that he should not be capricious in choosing food, because all of it is very useful. Then Ning said that she saw his father on TV, where they reported that his business was expanding. The girl said that she wanted to congratulate Xiao Lu on this and asked the little boy to help her. Without letting go of the pipe, he wrote something on a piece of paper and showed it to his father. The word congratulations was written on it. Seeing this, Xiao Lu smiled happily. This was so unusual for him that his parents did not even immediately understand what had happened. But when they saw the inscription, they were touched. The fact that little Xiaobao began to write was an incredible stroke of luck. And the father saw his son laugh for the first time. Then Xiao Lu beckoned his son over and moved closer to the phone. A little embarrassed, he thanked Ningxi for her congratulations. It was obvious that he was very flattered. Ningxi was also smiling into the phone at this time. She realized that the little boy had immediately fulfilled her request, and it was very pleasant. She thanked the now child and said that it was time for her to go. Little Xiaobao smiled happily and looked very happy. He barely put the phone down before grabbing the chopsticks and pulling the bowl of carrots towards him. The chopsticks began to fly through the air, and the dish began to disappear very quickly into the child's mouth. Jingli and his parents watched in amazement as the boy quickly and willingly ate the carrots he had previously disliked. They could not believe that he was doing this of his own free will. Lu Jingli said that they were exaggerating their joy a little. But it was more like jealousy because no one had ever managed to persuade Xiaobao to eat something against his will before. And the parents began to question Jingli about what the caller had said to the child. They thought that he should know more than he was saying. But Lu Jingli replied that the girl had only asked the baby to eat well, and not to pick at the food. She also asked him to convey congratulations to his brother on his financial success. But the parents continued to press. They still felt that Lu Jingli knew more than he was saying, but he no longer understood what they wanted from him. He tried to remember every word he had heard, but he did not notice anything special. Then the mother noticed that a real miracle had happened. After all, one phone call helped Xiaobao become more obedient than a year of treatment with a psychotherapist. She assumed that the girl must be very self-confident and even possess a powerful character. It seemed so to her, because only a strong personality could attract her eldest son. But he only replied that everything was not so at all, and the mother could not calm down. She turned to Lu Jingli and demanded that he help her brother win the unapproachable beauty. He agreed, but asked not to interfere in his brother's relationship and not to interrogate him. Jingli knew how closed off his brother was from everyone and did not want to cause him discomfort. The parents raised their hands and solemnly promised. The mother said she would not interfere, and the father seemed to promise this too, but said he would still be interested. Then Lu Jingli turned to his brother. He asked him to acknowledge how he had defended his interests, and he slyly asked if there was any reward for this. Xiao Lu turned around and looked at his brother over his shoulder. He felt awkward about having so much attention on his personal life, but he had to admit that his brother had definitely helped. Then he raised his hand and threw something small straight into Lu Jingli's hands. Lu Jingli caught it in midair, like a large, agile cat. Jingli unclenched his fist and looked at what he had gotten. In his palms was a small car key. The name was visible on the keychain: Bugatti. Jingli's mouth dropped open in surprise. These were the keys to the fastest and most prestigious car imaginable. Previously, he could only dream of it. Jingli rushed to his brother and threw his arms around him. He hugged him tightly and told him how much he loved him, how grateful he was, and how happy he was. However, when the flash of happiness passed, Jingli decided to ask Xiao Lu something he could not understand. He wanted to know why the proud girl refused to marry her brother, but Xiao Lu replied calmly that it didn't matter to him. He was determined to marry Ningxi, and was going to do everything he could to achieve it. Jingli was pleased by his confidence, but he believed that his brother would definitely need his help to achieve his goal, as a person more experienced in love affairs. And Xiao Lu calmly replied that he did not need advisors. He believed that his success in business gave him grounds to believe that he could succeed in everything he undertook. But Jingli thought differently. He hovered around his brother and explained that a romantic relationship with a girl was completely different from a business project. So the younger brother offered himself to the elder brother as a mentor in the field of romantic adventures and building relationships. And Xiao Lu was already beginning to hesitate. Suddenly the door of the office where the brothers were talking quietly opened. Little Xiaobao stood on the threshold. Lu Jingli gasped in surprise. It had never happened before that the boy would leave his room after going to bed. But now he got up, left the bedroom and came to his father's office. And now he stood in front of him, hugging his leg and looking imploringly into his eyes. Xiao Lu understood perfectly well what the child wanted, but he replied that the visit should wait, since they had already visited Ningxi the day before. Then the boy came up to the table and began to look at the mobile phone lying on it. His gaze was very eloquent and demanding. Father understood again. He said that there was no point in bothering them with calls either, since they had already talked during dinner. Lu Jingli had been watching the child in surprise the entire time. He saw that the little boy was constantly thinking about Ning Shi. When little Xiao Bao realized that his father would not allow him to do what he wanted, the little rascal turned his attention to his uncle. He walked up to Jingli and hugged his leg. The boy looked up at him pleadingly, straight into his eyes. And this pleading was completely unbearable for Jingli. But he could do nothing to help. The uncle explained it to his nephew. He tried to convey to him the idea that not everything can be obtained when you want it. Sometimes you have to wait. Jingli put his hand on the boy's shoulders and asked him not to be offended. He said that he could not arrange for the child to meet Ning, because he had a good excuse for calling. But in the end, Uncle added that they just had to be patient. After all, when Xiao Lu married Ning, the baby would be able to see her every day. This innocent remark caused the boy to suddenly burst into anger. He pushed his uncle away and ran out the door, slamming it with all his might. Jingli was at a loss. He didn't know what to do to calm the child down. But Xiao Lu advised him not to worry so much. The father also added that thanks to Ning Shi, there was no longer any fear that the baby would eat poorly again. This remark calmed the uncle down a little. The brothers continued to talk when they suddenly heard a noise and a crash from below. They looked at each other and realized that Xiao Bao was up to something. The men ran down the stairs as fast as they could. They ran down and fearfully expected to see something terrible there. Once downstairs, they didn't recognize their cozy and clean hall. Now it looked like an abandoned house, filled with broken furniture and damaged things. And little Xiao Bao stood in the middle of this chaos. In front of him on the floor lay the shards of a huge broken vase that had once decorated one of the tables. Xiao Lu shouted loudly at the boy and clenched his fists in anger. Lu Jingli covered his ears in despair and even squatted slightly. And the little boy suddenly let out a shrill scream and clenched his fists too. It seemed that his anger made him many times stronger than a little boy should be. He continued to grab and throw things indiscriminately. An antique dish, an elegant porcelain Chinese vase, a chair with thin carved legs would come under his hand. The child was destroying everything in his path. Lu Jingli put his hand on his brother's shoulder and quietly said that the boy would not stop until he saw Ning Shi. But Xiao Lu did not give in to persuasion. Jingli then tried to explain to his brother that he was just a child, not an adult subordinate of Xiao Lu, and did not deserve such strictness. However, the elder brother firmly stopped him. Xiao Lu firmly said that he did not need advice on raising children from his younger brother. Jingli couldn't stand it anymore. On one side, his older brother was screaming. On the other, his beloved nephew was destroying everything in his path. The young man clutched his head in despair, and Xiao Lu just calmly asked him to pull himself together and stop being hysterical. He was angry, but at the same time very cold. Jingli then decided that the best thing for him to do was to run away. He couldn't do anything about the situation anyway, so he turned around and ran away. But his brother wouldn't leave him. He angrily shouted at his younger brother to stay and help. But Jingli ran to the far wing of the mansion, where he sank down on the floor against the wall and burst into tears. Meanwhile, in her small, cozy apartment, Ning Shi was already getting ready for bed. She decided to look over the script again and review the text of tomorrow's episode. However, suddenly the mobile phone rang. At first, the girl did not even want to pick up the phone as it was quite late. But she changed her mind when she saw Lu Jingli's name on the screen. When she answered the call, she heard his sobbing and pleading voice on the other end. He was babbling that she needed to come to Xiao Lu's house urgently because the little boy had had a nervous breakdown. This was his last hope. Through her sobs, Ning couldn't even hear what he was saying to her at first, and asked him to repeat it. She only realized that something was wrong with little Xiao Bao. And something strange and scary was happening in the receiver. You could hear blows and sounds of falling, Xiao Lu's scream and Jingli's pleas to calm down. Ning began to pull on her clothes as she walked. She shouted into the phone that she was getting ready and would try to be there as soon as possible. Jingli asked her to hurry up and demanded that her brother stop. Ning Shi ran into the underground garage of the apartment complex and jumped on a parked motorcycle. She didn't really like riding it, but sometimes speed was very useful. Putting on her helmet, the girl roared the engine and sped down the road. She thought that just a few days ago her life had been much calmer and simpler. With the little boy in her life came chaos and confusion. However, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Little Xiao Bao had completely captured her heart. Thanks to the powerful machine, a few minutes later, Accompanied by a maid, she entered the spacious hall of the Lu family mansion. Ning was dressed in a black suit and held a helmet under her arm. In the hall, an amazing scene opened up before her eyes. Xiao Lu was holding the baby by the collar with one hand and was trying to catch and hold his hands with the other. But the baby was wriggling and kicking. There was an unimaginable noise and squealing in the room. However, everything fell silent as soon as Nin demanded that everyone stop. She grabbed the baby in her arms and hugged him. Xiao Lu even recoiled in amazement and couldn't find what to say, and the baby looked at her with eyes full of tears and trembled violently. But seeing her face in front of him, he gradually began to calm down. Nin hugged him and rocked him gently. She stroked his back gently and kept telling him that everything was okay and that all the bad stuff was over. When the baby quieted down, she turned to Xiao Lu and spoke to him coldly. The girl said that she was not a member of the family and had no say, but she still had something to say. No longer embarrassed, she forcefully told Xiao Lu that his methods of education were very bad. With such small children, it was worth showing affection and warmth, and with Xiao Bao, especially. Finally, she poked her finger into the man's chest and demanded that he continue scolding the child. After all, it was clear to everyone that the child was very scared. Oddly enough, Xiao Lu listened to her with his head bowed obediently. He did not object or argue, but only replied that he was having a very bad day today. Here Lu Jingli also dared to interject that he had already told his brother about his methods of education, but was simply afraid to touch him. Everyone could see that with Ning Shi, the man was becoming completely different. Then the girl, still hugging the baby, sat down on the sofa. She asked Jingli to tell her what had led to such a terrible scandal. He sighed and said that the little boy had been asking for a meeting with her, or at least a phone call. But his father had sternly refused him, and that was when this terrible outburst of anger had happened. But Ning still found it hard to believe that this whole nightmare was all because of her. She wasn't sure if Jingli had told her everything, so she decided to ask the little boy directly. She leaned towards him and spoke softly. The girl asked if he really had ruined everything around him just because he wanted to see her so much. The little boy looked at her silently. Finally, silence reigned in the mansion. The frightened maids quietly began to clean, and the house gradually regained its former appearance, and Ning Shi carried little Xiao Bao to his room and put him to bed. She lay down next to him so that he could sleep next to her without any fear. The girl stroked his hands and began to quietly sing a song about 7 brothers. Each of them corresponded to one of the 7 colors of the rainbow. The baby listened very attentively. And Lu Jingli stood outside the door of the nursery and listened to the song. He thought that it was unlikely that little Xiao Bao would find it interesting or like it. However, after a few minutes, the child began to snore peacefully in his crib. He breathed quietly and calmly, and only occasionally his trembling hands reminded him of his recent hysteria. After confirming that he was fast asleep, Ning Shi carefully stood up and stroked him again. Then, after one last look around, she quietly left the room and closed the door behind her. She stretched tiredly and yawned. And Jingli asked her why she sang such an old song, since there were many modern and more youthful melodies. Ning calmly replied that she knew many other songs, but they were not very suitable for small children, so she sang what she heard in her childhood. They were deep in conversation, and didn't immediately notice Xiao Lu quietly approaching. He wanted to know how the girl managed to get to his house so quickly, unless she was somewhere nearby. At this, Ning Shi winked slyly and replied that she had rushed over on her motorcycle. Only then did he notice her tight suit and helmet lying on the sofa. Xiao Lu said sternly that it was very dangerous, and asked Ning not to do it again. And he thought to himself that she was so beautiful that evening that he simply could not find the words. Indeed, Nin now resembled a fairy from a fairy tale, the embodiment of wind and freedom. And now she was about to go home since everything was okay with the baby. Then Xiao Lu gathered his courage and said that he had one request for her. It was obvious that he was feeling awkward and afraid of being rejected. Nin turned around with interest. Having already gotten to know this strange man a little, she could expect anything from him, any strangeness. And he said that the boy's mental state is very unstable right now. Therefore, it would be good for him if Ning, who has such a calming effect on him, would move into their mansion for a while. This was quite unexpected for the girl. She was puzzled and said that it was not necessary at all. After all, she could come to the baby at any time if necessary. But Xiao Lu responded that the situation could be unpredictable, especially at night. and he didn't want Ning to take unnecessary risks to get to them. It was a reasonable argument. Seeing Ning's hesitation, Xiao Lu said that it could be very dangerous for her, and he didn't want that. He added that he understood that his request was connected with certain inconveniences for Ning. But still, the man was first and foremost a father, so he hoped for her consent. Ningxi thought about it. She weighed the pros and cons of this proposal. Never before had she been in such a difficult situation. And Lu Jingli, who had heard the entire conversation, thought with admiration that his brother had chosen an excellent tactic. He even gave him a secret thumbs up and an approving wink. Then they all heard the sound of the door opening. Ningxi turned around, alarmed. Little Xiao Bao stood at the threshold. It seemed that he had heard, if not the entire conversation, then certainly the last part of it. And now he looked at Ningxi questioningly and pleadingly. Suddenly he jumped up to her and hugged her leg. The child pressed closer and closer, and his eyes began to fill with tears. Ning knelt down, hugged him and held him tightly to her chest. She held him and told him that he shouldn't be afraid because she was right there with him. The girl stroked the boy's head and felt his tense little body gradually relax. Her heart filled with tenderness for this poor boy, and again she had to put him to bed. True, this time she managed to do without a song because the baby, tired from a hard day, fell asleep quite quickly. Ning looked at him again and walked out into the hallway, quietly turning the creaking door handle. Xiao Lu was already waiting for her outside the door. He looked at her silently, and in his eyes the girl saw request and hope. She thought again and made a decision. Ningxi coughed and firmly said that she promised him that she would stay with little Xiao Bao. She simply could not do otherwise. Xiao Lu's gaze immediately warmed up. It was as if he had lifted a heavy burden from his shoulders and took a deep breath. The man thanked her quietly. Lu Jingli, who was standing nearby, was left gaping in amazement. He realized that right before his eyes, the two had just agreed to live together. Meanwhile, Xiao Lu had already brought Ning to one of the rooms near the nursery. He said that Ning could live there and promised to send people to do the renovation. Afterwards, he immediately handed the girl a bunch of keys to the house and numerous rooms. There was also a key to the attic, where Xiao Bao sometimes liked to lock himself in and hide. Ning was worried. In a panic, she asked Xiao Lu to wait a little while, and asked if he really trusted her so much that he would immediately give her all the possible login keys and passwords. And he looked at her in surprise, not understanding her confusion. After a pause, the man asked if there was anything he could do to make her feel calmer. Nin replied that she was just joking. She had already decided that she would stay in the house for a while, as long as the baby needed her. But she sensed something was wrong. In this situation, it seemed strange to her that the owner of the house was handing over all the keys and access codes to a girl he barely knew. And all this just because his little son liked her. Suddenly, she thought in horror that this scene reminded her of a scene from a movie. She felt as if she and Xiao Lu were newlyweds, and she had moved into his house forever. In her panic, Ning even dropped her keys on the floor, but she immediately knelt down to pick them up. She told herself to calm down because it didn't mean anything, and a little later she was already sleeping peacefully in the bed of little Xiao Bao, hugging him with one arm. This place seemed the safest to her. The girl looked very at home. She was already dreaming peacefully and did not notice how someone's shadow fell on her face. It was Xiao Lu who quietly entered the nursery. He decided to take another look at his son before going to bed, but unexpectedly found Ning sleeping in his bed. He looked at them for a while. So sweet, so familiar, so serene. Then he leaned low over Nin and listened to her breathing. More than anything in the world, he wanted to kiss her now, and now he leaned down very low and almost pressed his lips to her cheek. But at the last moment, Xiao Lu quietly whispered that he was leaving for Japan. The next morning was beautiful and serene. The sun was shining brightly on the mansion and the green lawn in front of it. Ningxi woke up and sat up in bed. She stretched sweetly and looked around. Next to her on the bed sat little Xiao Bao, holding a book in his hands. She looked at him and smiled cheerfully. He was incredibly cute now, so serious and a little shaggy from sleep. Nin wished him good morning. The little boy smiled contentedly and blushed slightly. Ningxi patted his head and cheerfully informed him that she didn't have to go to work today, so they could spend the whole day together. A little later, they were sitting in the living room with the baby. Nin was rereading the script on the sofa, and the boy was drawing at a low table, with pencils and sheets of paper laid out in front of him. He drew very seriously and concentratedly, and then he came up to Ning. She turned her head and saw that the boy was holding a sheet of paper with a drawing in front of her. The girl realized that he had tried for her and now wanted to give her a gift. It was very sweet and touching. On the sheet of paper was drawn her portrait, quite accurate and beautiful. It was framed in a scarlet heart. The baby nervously watched her reaction. Ning was touched. She hugged the child, held him close, and thanked him. She even kissed him on the forehead to show how pleased she was with his gift. And then footsteps were heard in the corridor. Nin looked at the door with concern. Xiao Lu appeared at the door. Dressed in a simple white robe, he looked completely different, more simple and homely. But Ning looked at him puzzled. She asked if he had to go to work. It was already Monday. But he said in a relaxed manner that he had a day off today. That's why he was so calm. Looking over Ning's shoulder, he saw a drawing in her hands. Xiao Lu remarked that it was the first portrait his son had ever drawn. Ning replied that she liked it very much, and that it was a great honor. Suddenly, Ningxi's mobile phone rang on the table. The little boy turned around and looked at it with displeasure. He really didn't want anything to distract his father and Ning on this day. The girl answered the call and now listened to the voice on the other end of the line. It was one of the film's producers. He told Ning that the opening ceremony for the filming would soon take place at the Pearl Hotel. Nin glanced at her watch in alarm. There were less than 2 hours left until the start, and she might not have time to pack and get there. She was in a panic. The heroine excitedly asked why she had not been informed earlier, since time had been lost. But the interlocutor replied that it was not his problem, asked not to disturb him, and hung up. Nin listened in confusion to the short beeps coming from the receiver, and had absolutely no idea what to do now. Everything could collapse at the last moment, and suddenly a strong anger came over her. The girl realized that she had been deliberately not warned earlier so that she would not be at the ceremony. Ning was so angry that she threw her phone on the floor in a rage. She was already fed up with Sui Luo's tricks and schemes, and now she was sure that they were involved. However, she suddenly remembered something. She was no longer alone in her home. Ningxi looked at Xiao Lu and his son, who were standing nearby, in surprise. Ning walked up to them and knelt down. She took the baby by the shoulders and apologized for her anger. The last thing she wanted was to scare the child, and Xiao Lu just calmly asked her what happened. He didn't look disappointed or offended. He just looked at her with interest, waiting for an answer. Ning explained to him in frustration that the opening ceremony was about to begin, and that she had only just been informed of it. Now she would most likely not be able to get to the hotel in time. But then Xiao Lu surprised her. He thought for a second and then said that they would make it in time and there was no need to worry. Ning shook her head, bitterly saying that she had too much to do and too little time. However, the man only calmly asked her to wait a little. Suddenly, as if out of thin air, a mobile phone appeared in his hand. He put the phone to his ear and stepped aside a little. The girl looked at him puzzled, not understanding what was happening and what he was up to. 10 minutes later, a tall young man with an extravagant hairdo and a small suitcase entered the mansion. It was the famous Arthur, the stylist of most of the stars. Ningxi still didn't understand anything. She was completely confused after hearing Xiao Lu's conversation, and only asked why he invited Arthur. She couldn't believe that this wizard would soon make a star out of her. But Xiao Lu calmly confirmed that Arthur would do everything necessary for her. Then Ning asked if the boss helped all his subordinates get out of difficult situations like that. After all, it still sounded completely fantastic to her. Xiao Lu then explained to her that the corporation owned by the Lu family was the largest player in the market, and Arthur's company, although it held an important position, was subordinate to it. Ning was completely lost. It was as if she had been transported to some other world, where completely different laws and rules reigned. It knocked the ground out from under her feet, and Xiao Lu twirled the car keys on his finger and said that Arthur's car was parked at the door, and they would have to fix Ning on the way, because there was little time left. Ningxi's eyes widened. It seemed like she was now becoming a part of this amazing and unknown world that Xiao Lu belonged to. Ningxi was in a panic. She understood that it would be difficult for them to get to the Pearl Hotel, located on the other side of the city, but it was simply necessary. Leaving the house, they quickly got into the car. Xiao Lu got behind the wheel, the baby sat next to him. Ningxi stretched out tensely from behind. Arthur noted that she had good skin and facial features. Sitting next to her, he carefully examined her face. Finally, the stylist asked what event she was going to. This was necessary to know in order to select the appropriate image. Ning Shi looked at him hopefully. She replied that this would be the opening ceremony of the film, where she plays, although not the main but quite noticeable role. Arthur snapped his fingers in satisfaction. He said that the girl should trust him and promised that she would be the center of attention. After some time, the car stopped at the tall building of the Pearl Hotel. The parking lot in front of him was already filled with luxury cars of arriving guests. Xiao Lu turned back and looked at Ning. He appreciated Arthur's efforts and said that it looked very good. And little Xiao Bao looked at her with all his eyes. It had to be admitted that the stylist knew his business. Ning Shi transformed in a matter of minutes. She now wore an exquisite, intricately cut scarlet dress. The hairstyle was decorated with a bright flower. The girl looked at herself in the rearview mirror. At first, she didn't even recognize herself in the reflection. It seemed impossible to do something like this in such a short time. However, Arthur succeeded perfectly. And now Ning Shi could already believe that she would succeed. She decided to herself that she could do anything. The heroine looked at Xiao Bao, frozen with delight. She gently stroked the baby's head and said that she had to go. However, she promised to return after work. Ning opened the car door and stepped decisively onto the sidewalk. Without exaggeration, now she was beautiful, and looked little like that insecure simpleton who was locked in the back room. As she left, she turned around and looked back. Xiao Lu, still dressed only in a bathrobe, stood near the car holding his son's hand, and he cheerfully waved after her. Ning Shi smiled and thought that her life had changed too much. Previously, she was completely alone, but now her soul was full of warmth and love. The beauty moved towards her future. Meanwhile, the mourners returned to the car. Now Arthur got behind the wheel. He decided to find out from the boss who the beautiful lady was, whose beauty he only helped to reveal. The young man assumed that she was new to the company. However, Xiao Lu replied that she works for the film company SM Entertainment. Arthur's eyes widened in surprise. It was unusual that he was entrusted with the makeup of SM's new star. This could mean that the girl has a great future ahead of her, and the hotel conference room was already full. Camera flashes flashed from everywhere and muffled music was heard. The ceremony was due to begin any minute. One of the journalists was just interviewing Shui Luo. He noted that this is the second role she has played together with Zhao Shizhu, and everyone was interested in whether they had a personal relationship. Shui Luo heard the question and smiled slyly. She replied that her partner was very attractive, but they were just friends. And he, hearing this, froze in bewilderment because his heart was conquered by Shui Luo. Other journalists pestered the film's chief director, Guo Dao, with questions. Everyone wanted to know if Ning Shi would be at the premiere. The director replied that she had received the invitation. Questions rained down one after another. Someone asked if the director was afraid to give a significant role to a newcomer, which was Ning Shi. And some even suggested that Ning's role is more important than others. Guo Dao was confused. He didn't understand why all the questions were focused on only the two main characters. Suddenly, one of the reporters noticed that the performer of the second leading role appeared in the hall. The crowd made a noise and turned towards the entrance. First, everyone saw charming slender legs, shod in a pair of beautiful scarlet shoes with silk ribbons. Their owner walked lightly on the floor, covered with a layer of confetti. Ning Shi entered the hall, and although the expression on her face was alarmed and even a little frightened, nothing could overshadow her gentle beauty. The girl picked up a pen and walked up to the stand, where all members of the film crew left their autographs in honor of the start of filming. She also signed it. In complete silence, Ning Shi turned to the hall and put her pen on the table, and then the crowd burst into cheers. Everyone welcomed the new star of the film. One of the journalists was the first to jump up to Ning and point the microphone directly at her face. The girl was even a little taken aback by such pressure, and journalists were primarily interested in Ning's dress. Apparently, it was the famous creation of fashion designer Karl Lagerfeld, which cost a fortune. The name of the couturier, known to everyone in the world of fashion and show business, made a huge impression on Nin. She couldn't believe that Xiao Lu allowed her to wear a dress that cost millions. And the curious journalist continued her questions. Now she asked if Arthur was the stylist of the newly minted star. But the heroine no longer wanted to answer two personal questions. She hastily got rid of the persistent girl with an offer to pay attention to the other heroes of the evening. But the girl was immediately replaced by a young man in an inconspicuous suit. He persistently asked what roles Ning had played before, and then the beauty thought, It was worth admitting that her career had not previously been characterized by a rapid rise and an abundance of bright proposals. She timidly listed her latest characters, which included a schoolgirl, a fox, and a female demon. This caused considerable surprise among journalists. One of them began to inquire why all the roles were not the main ones. He also noted that they all portrayed villains. But Ning responded with a serene smile that it didn't matter to her whether she had the main role or not. She loved the acting profession too much to neglect anything. Hearing her answers to journalists, the director noted that the girl behaved well for a beginner. He believed that her qualifications and knowledge were quite enough to achieve significant success. However, then his assistant drew Guodao's attention to one unexpected circumstance. This was a strange reaction from one of the actresses. Taking a closer look, they both saw that the leading lady, Shui Luo, was literally losing her temper with anger. Even her fists were clenched tightly. And indeed, Shui Luo was furiously wondering where her simpleton sister got the designer dress from. After all, now her pitiful body was dressed in millions. The star never expected that a simpleton could have money for such a stunning outfit. But she decided that this evening she would try to do everything, so that even this dress would not help her enemy. And then, as luck would have it, one of the journalists jumped up to Shui Luo, and instead of admiring her role and career, he began to persistently ask what she could say about the role that Ning Shi was about to play. Shui Luo calmly told him that her younger sister was a pretty good actress. Therefore, she felt that she could handle the role. Ning heard her answer out of the corner of her ear, and although he sounded pretty good to her, the girl did not believe in her sister's sincerity. Now she could only suspect Shui Luo of wanting to take advantage of her weakness. In her excitement, Ning squeezed the hem of her dress tightly. It took her a lot of effort to control herself. However, she remembered how much she had to work to get here. She and her sister exchanged eloquent glances. One thought that now she would not allow herself to be trampled, and the second one decided to wait, because from a higher height it would be more painful to fall. Finally, the press conference came to an end and the journalists left. Only now Ning felt that she could relax a little. However, suddenly she heard a dissatisfied voice behind her. It was Zhang. She contemptuously asked why Ning came to the event, because no one was waiting for her there. She also blamed Ning for drawing too much attention to herself as the second actress. And this did not at all correspond to the unspoken rules accepted in this world. And Ning Shi calmly replied that she did not want this at all. But since I received an invitation, I considered it possible to attend and answer the questions asked. Zhang was furious. She did not at all expect such a rebuff. In the end, in order to finally knock down the newly minted star's arrogance, she ordered Ning to help her with drinks. But the girl had no intention of doing this. She reminded Zhang with a smile that this was exactly her responsibility. Sister Zhang, turning white with anger, replied that Ning was too arrogant. According to her, the second actress did not do anything special. She simply played a role, so there was no reason for pride and arrogance. Ning decided not to respond to this attack at all. She simply turned around and headed towards the exit, intending to calmly leave. Then Zhang just boiled. She screamed at Ning, demanding to stop because no one allowed her to leave. But the girl said over her shoulder that she had already heard enough. Therefore, without hesitation, she left, rustling her dress goodbye. She couldn't see that Zhang was clenching her teeth threateningly as she stared after her. She seriously decided to teach her rebellious sister a lesson that she would remember for a long time. Sometime later, a lavish celebration of the film's release took place in the Ning family's luxurious apartment. The huge mansion was flooded with lights and sparkled throughout the area. Inside there was the clinking of glasses and cheers of joy. It seemed that everyone present was equally happy about the successful completion of filming, and only Ning Shi, standing in the corner, sipped a non-alcoholic cocktail. She watched the others thoughtfully and did not look recklessly happy at all. One of the guests looked attentively at the girls. He suddenly accurately noticed that the fact that two leading actresses of one of the films belong to the same family is very rare. It truly was an incredible coincidence. Ning also repeatedly thought that only her education differed from Shui Luo. The rest was very similar. And then a tall, thin man with gray hair in an expensive suit suddenly appeared on the threshold of the room. It was the father of the family, Ning Yaohul. The guests began to make noise. One of the men raised a glass in honor of his father, and said that the company was honored that Ning Yao decided to join the celebration. And he hugged Shui Luo and condescendingly said that he would not disturb anyone, but only wanted to see his daughter. She replied that her father spoiled her too much. Ningxi watched this idyllic scene with bitterness. The father was very attentive to his daughter. However, Shui Luo was only an adopted daughter, while Ningxi was her own. Ningxi decided to leave quietly and had already gotten up to leave the table. Seeing her neighbor's surprised look, she explained that she wanted to leave for a while. The girl went out onto the balcony and breathed in the air filled with the coolness of the night. It cleared her head and calmed her breathing. Ning raised her eyes to the sky and began to look at the stars. They were beautiful, but their cold, flickering light suggested thoughts of loneliness. Now the girl felt the same as these stars. She was beautiful too, but very lonely. There were people around, a lot of people, but they were all too far away. Suddenly, she heard quiet footsteps behind her. Turning around, Ningxi saw Mr. Yao. It was strange to see him here alone at the height of the holiday. When the girl asked what he was doing here, he hesitated. The man could not or did not want to answer a direct question, but his appearance did not inspire confidence. Then Ningxi assumed that he deliberately decided to catch her alone, and she wanted to believe that he was not planning anything bad towards her. This remark suddenly made Mr. Yao angry. He sharply asked what she meant and even swung at the girl. However, Ning was alert and caught his hand in time. Yes, now she was completely different and had no intention of being offended. And now she stood opposite her biological father, who was so distant from her and so harsh. Ning held his hand with which he was about to hit her and glared at him, and Mr. Yao had already snatched his hand and was looking at it angrily. Through gritted teeth, he threatened that now she would never see a role, and Ning boldly replied that he had nothing to do with getting the role, so he has no right to take it away. She didn't look scared at all, but rather confident and calm. Then Mr. Yao, straightening his tie that had fallen to the side, said that he remembered her tricks and scandals in the past. He believed that her only goal was to destroy the family's reputation. This shocked Ningxi. She never thought that her father had such an opinion of her. They might not have been close enough, but family still meant a lot to her. And Mr. Yao said that he was ready to do anything if only she would refuse this role. He even promised Ning to get another role, as long as she did not consider him obligated to be a good father. This sounded like a joke to the girl. She noticed that she did not understand how he could, looking her straight in the eyes, talk about fatherhood. After all, he was never her real father. And then Shui Luo suddenly appeared on the threshold. She saw her adoptive father and half-sister standing opposite with tense faces and asked what happened. However, Mr. Yao did not want to explain anything but only hugged her waist. Taking Shui Luo into the room, he asked her to find a new actress for the second lead role instead of Ningxi. His stepdaughter excitedly asked him about the reasons for this decision, but Ning saw that she was secretly smiling with satisfaction. There was an evil irony in this decision. After all, the girl worked so hard and prepared for this role for a long time, and she received it, and along with the role, hope for a new future. And now the person who spent his entire life devaluing and ignoring her achievements is doing it again. And he throws her down again. And how painful it was for her because this was her real father. And it was unbearable to see him, with love and care, hugging his adopted, and not at all his own, daughter Shui Luo. They left, and Ning thought bitterly about her role. She had been waiting for it for so long, waiting for this opportunity. And now all my dreams have burst like a soap bubble. The girl squeezed the plastic cocktail glass in her hand. It cracked with a plaintive sound, to which Ning responded with a quiet groan. Suddenly, she noticed that the attention of all the guests was focused on the entrance to the hall. It seemed that someone whom everyone knew and had been waiting for a long time appeared. For a moment, the people parted, and Ning saw the person entering. It was her former fiancé Su Yan. He walked up to Shui Luo and within a moment was holding her in his arms. She looked at him lovingly and asked how he was doing. The guy asked her not to worry. Their tender hugs and passionate glances resonated with acute pain in Ning's soul. For some reason, she always came across the people who caused the greatest suffering. Then Su Yan also noticed her. His handsome face barely twisted with annoyance. The young man was clearly not happy to see his ex-fiancé in front of him. However, Shui Luo stepped forward, standing between them. She said sarcastically that Ning seemed to have drunk too much. Shui suggested asking Yan to escort the inebriated Ning home. Ning was no longer going to tolerate this. She turned away and walked away, saying over her shoulder that this was not necessary. She walked away with quick steps, so that her dress rustled behind her. Shui Luo watched this with satisfaction. However, When she turned to Su Yang a moment later, her face took on a worried expression. Shui was worried that her sister had never forgiven her, and did not know what to do about it. But Yan simply said indifferently that he didn't care. But he also believed that Ning would never forgive his sister. Meanwhile, Xiaolu and baby Xiaobao decided to meet Ning Shi after the ceremony. The man arrived in a large sports car and had been waiting for quite a long time for Ning to come out. However, time passed and the girl still did not show up. Then Xiaolu unfastened his belt and decided to go get her himself. The baby anxiously grabbed his hand. For some reason he was nervous and did not want to be alone. Then his father affectionately patted him on the head. He asked to wait and promised to return very quickly. After entering the building, Xiaolu took out his smartphone and began dialing Ning Shi's number. However, a mechanical voice on the phone told him that the subscriber was temporarily unavailable. This puzzled the man a little and he continued to dial the number over and over again. Suddenly, walking down the corridor, he heard a familiar ringtone coming from somewhere. Xiaolu began to look around, and to his embarrassment he saw that he was standing at the door of the women's toilet. Apparently, the music sounded from there. He was momentarily happy that he had finally found Ning Shi. However, he immediately frowned in confusion. After all, he had to somehow enter this room without looking stupid. Yet Xiaolu was a determined and strong man. He hesitated a moment, turned the knob and pushed the door. Upon entering, to his horror and surprise, he saw Ning Shi sitting unconscious on the floor. It seemed that only the wall behind was preventing her from falling. The girl was barefoot, and her elegant shoes were helplessly lying nearby. Xiaolu rushed towards her, not understanding what had happened. He picked Ning up and lifted her into his arms, hugging her close to him. Her eyes were closed, but the girl was breathing quite normally. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and looked at him with a dull look. In a weak voice, Ning asked who he was. When he introduced himself, the girl suddenly began to struggle and scream that it was a lie. In her opinion, Xiaolu would never be able to enter the women's restroom, and the man still couldn't understand whether she was so drunk that she didn't recognize him. Holding the girl's hand, he asked what kind of confirmation she would like, and when she asked to see her passport without hesitation, he took it out and gave it to her. Xiaolu already realized that in this state it was better not to argue with Ning. He waited patiently until she was finally able to read his name on the document, and then he asked if they could leave already. But then Ning began to struggle and scream again. She screamed that she would not go anywhere with Xiaolu, because he was the devil himself. It was quite unexpected to hear this. It might even make Xiaolu laugh, but he didn't expect that in Ning's eyes he seemed like a monster. Suddenly he heard footsteps approaching. Someone was walking along the corridor and was already very close. The man picked up Ning's shoes and asked her to quickly get up, but she was completely incapable of this. The steps, meanwhile, were getting closer, and Xiaolu only thought that if someone saw him in the women's restroom now, it would be a significant blow to his reputation. Then the door handle turned and a girl entered the toilet. She began calling Ning Shi and looking into the empty booths. At this time, Xiaolu, holding the girl's hands, sat huddled in one of the booths. He covered her mouth with his hand, but Ning tried to mutter something. The girl who entered clearly heard suspicious sounds because she moved on, checking all the booths. She continued to call Ning. Xiaolu began to look around nervously. He understood that he needed to come up with something quickly. The girl had already reached out her hand to the handle of their booth, but heard passionate moans and whispers from inside. Blushing, she realized that there were two people inside the booth, and they clearly did not need company. Covering her face with her hands in embarrassment, she ran out of the toilet. The girl did not want to know who participated in the romantic scene in the booth, and did not understand such a strange choice of place for the meeting. Hearing the door close behind the unexpected guest, Xiaolu breathed a sigh of relief. No matter how strange it may look from the outside, his trick worked quite well. He released the hand that was covering Ningshi's mouth and sternly shook his finger at her. One problem was solved, but there was no point in relaxing. Now they should try to leave the building as quickly and quietly as possible. However, Ning was completely exhausted and in addition began to hiccup. Seeing this, Xiaolu thought that she was much more trouble than his little son right now, and he should have come up with some kind of plan. Suddenly something happened. The girl straightened up like a decompressed spring and hit the wall with her fist with all her might. For a moment, Xiaolu thought there was a small explosion. She hit the wall with such force that the plaster even began to crack. In addition, the girl swore loudly, and when the shocked Xiaolu tried to tell her that girls shouldn't swear, She replied that she didn't care anymore. Something in her voice made him look at Ning with concern, and she suddenly tiredly leaned against him and began to mutter something. After listening, the man realized that she regretted that her father despised her so much, and Zhao Lu only thought that she was so dangerously close to him, and he snuggles as if by chance. But his embarrassment only angered Ning. She screamed that she could not be loved. The man was surprised to hear that she considered herself too ugly, and he thinks that it is impossible to love such an ugly girl. Then Xiao Lu, embarrassed, said that he did not consider himself handsome, rather the opposite. And Ning began to object to this, which looked quite interesting. The girl began to convince him of her attractiveness so ardently that Xiao Lu had to think about it. It was strange and incomprehensible to him. After some time, Xiao Lu managed to persuade Ning to leave. They went down to the underground garage, but the man still had to carry the weakened Ning in his arms. There, Lu Jingli suddenly rushed towards them. He stood near his car and waved his hand happily at the sight of the couple. Xiao Lu stopped in surprise. He did not understand how his brother could find out where he was and what he was doing. However, this could be thought about later. In the meantime, I had to take care of the girl. Xiao Lu opened the car door and carefully put Ning in. Jingli stood nearby and looked at them with shining eyes. Then Xiao Lu decided to ask his brother about what happened at the ceremony, because he was also invited. The man understood that in order to get so drunk, Ning must have had reasons. Lu Jingli said that the ceremony was a success, and the media commented on it very favorably. According to him, everything went very well. Xiao Lu then asked his brother who Ning Shi was meeting with that evening. He thought that if the ceremony was successful, then there was some person who could very much upset it. Jingli thought about it. He was able to remember that in addition to the film crew, Ning was dating a man named Ning Yao Hul. The young man suggested that Ning had too much alcohol because she met a man with whom she had previously been close. And if the girl saw that everything was fine with him, she could get upset. Having said this, Jingli immediately regretted it. After all, he noticed how dissatisfied Xiao Lu's face became. The young man was even a little scared. On the way home, Lu Jingli suggested somehow entertaining Ning Shi. After all, their whole family was very rich, and they could afford a lot. And the girl clearly needed a break from thoughts about Shui Luo. But Xiao Lu believed that it was not yet time to open the world of luxury and vivid impressions to Ning Shi. The man was afraid that they might turn her head too much. He turned around and looked back. In the back seat of the car, Ning dozed quietly while holding Xiao Bao in her arms. And I had to admit that it looked very nice and homely. So quietly, each thinking about his own, they drove up to the Lu family's mansion. Zhao stopped the car in front of a tall wrought iron gate. However, a small surprise awaited the brothers there. After getting out of the car, Ning Shi suddenly seemed to see the beauty of this sports car. She started running around and praising her. Xiao Lu watched this in shock. Many thoughts were running through his head. This day was as strange as it could be. Even little Xiao Bao watched his pet with wide eyes in surprise. He couldn't understand why Ning was acting so strange this evening. All this amused Lu Jingli so much that he even asked if Xiao Lu Ning was jealous of her car. After all, her passion seemed very sincere. Then Xiao Lu quietly called the manager and ordered him to bring a large hammer. His tone was so strange that he did not even dare to ask a single question, but only nodded. But Lu Jingli, who heard this, asked his brother not to do this. He reminded that the car costs a lot of money and asked to give the car to him if it became completely unnecessary. And suddenly, a moment later, Jingli was already flying to the ground. He was driven back by Ning Shi's masterful grip. The girl stood over the defeated young man, and her eyes burned with an unkind fire. In a voice trembling with anger, she asked who dared to encroach on her beloved car, and Lu Jingli just moaned quietly, trying to get up, and babbled that he was wrong. He couldn't believe that he had suffered from a simple tackle, even though he had been practicing judo for many years. Meanwhile, Ning was already driving. She affectionately stroked the steering wheel of the car and cooed to him. The manager was discouraged. He had never witnessed such a strange scene before. But Xiao Lu just waved his hand and reassured him, saying that everything was fine. He leaned over to little Xiao Bao and said that it was time for him to go to bed. Indeed, the time was quite late, but the child did not even think about sleep, carried away by extraordinary adventures. Then the father gently explained to the child that women usually do not like it when someone close to them sees their dark side, especially if this person is very dear to them, the kid thought. He liked his father's words about his dear man so much that he resignedly agreed to go into the house with the manager. And Lu Jingli reproached Xiao Lu for giving the child unnecessary hope. However, seeing his brother's dissatisfied look, he immediately retreated and prepared to leave. Jingli realized that he probably wanted to ride with Ningxi, just the two of them. He turned around and shouted over his shoulder that he was leaving. But in fact, the cunning one realized that he had a good chance to try out a recently purchased telephoto lens for surveillance, and Xiao Lu had already quickly jumped to the car. He grabbed the door handle and looked inside decisively, intending to sit down. A moment later, the man was already inside. But Ningxi was not at all happy about this. Moreover, she displeasedly asked why he got into the car and whether he wanted to take it away. To this, Xiao Lu calmly replied that he was not interested in the car at all. Slyly squinting, he wondered if the beauty really didn't understand what he really needed. And then Ning seemed to be pushed by something. She looked at Xiao and seemed to see him for the first time. It seems that the girl began to understand something, and the man was surprised to think that he was a little nervous. Then he took out a cigarette and slowly lit it. He thought that Ning was even a little jealous of the car that she liked so much. The girl looked at him in surprise. She had never seen the financier smoking before. She didn't even suspect this habit of his, and he leaned back in his seat and continued to think. Xiao Lu understood that thoughts about her past and even, to some extent, her present were disturbing him. He glanced sideways at Ning and tried to imagine her personal life. It is quite possible that her heart was not free. Xiao Lu remembered how, at his request, Lu Jingli collected all possible information about Ningxi and her life. Then his brother brought him a huge stack of folders containing a variety of details. I remember he couldn't even master all the materials and read to the end. So there could very well be something that went unnoticed. And now Xiao suddenly realized that he wanted to finally clarify this issue. And although he admitted that he was giving in to Ning's past connections, he still asked her to talk about it. Nervous, he even offered her a cigarette. Starting this conversation was not at all easy, even for such a brave and determined person that Xiao Lu was. Ning looked at him in surprise and shook her head. She seemed not to notice the tension of the moment and the indecisiveness of her interlocutor. Then Xiao Lu extended his hand, passing thin strands of her fragrant hair between his fingers. He pulled her towards him, placing his hand on the back of her head, so that their faces were very close. Inhaling the fragrant cigarette smoke, Ning coughed and pulled away dissatisfied. The sensations were not pleasant, and Xiao Lu took another deep drag on his cigarette. He continued to look at her carefully, not daring to start a conversation. His uncertainty and languid glances without continuation were already beginning to irritate Ning. Now only dissatisfaction was written on her face. But the man seemed only amused by her reaction. The girl suddenly realized that she felt like a toy in some kind of game she did not understand. And then suddenly Xiao threw the cigarette out the car window. Its tip finally flashed brightly in the darkness of the night, drawing a fiery arc, and went out. A moment later, his arms wrapped around the girl's waist and pulled her towards him. Xiao felt the tender naked back tense in the deep neckline of the dress under his hands. He moved very close and almost touched her ear with his lips. Xiao Lu said quietly that he was not going to stop this time. Ning's light breath tickled his skin. The man moved away slightly and managed to see her amazed eyes very close. However, he was already in a hurry to press his lips to hers. His hand rested on the back of the girl's head, gently running through her hair. Xiao Lu kissed her, greedily inhaling the intoxicating aroma emitted by her hair. He hugged her tightly but very gently, and at some point he felt that the girl's thin hand lay on his waist. Now it already looked like a real hug. It seemed like this kiss lasted forever. When Xiao finally pulled away to take a breath, he looked at Ningxi a little embarrassed. To his great surprise, he saw that her eyes were closed. Moreover, she even snored quietly. Suddenly, the man realized that the lady had simply fallen asleep. This fact discouraged him so much that Xiao Lu even grabbed his head. This was the first time this had happened to him, and it bothered him quite a bit. He didn't understand how it happened that he was so attracted to this girl. After all, at first glance there was nothing unusual about her. Xiao Lu remembered their first meeting well. Then Ning simply walked past him in the corridor of the business center. Most likely she didn't even pay attention to him. But he suddenly froze when he heard the click of her heels. Xiao Lu then stopped as if his heart had missed a beat. He looked after her and then something happened. Most of all, he then wanted the girl to turn around. And although there was no explanation for this, it happened. and then he carried her out in the arms of their cramped, locked closet. It was a simple accident, but it seemed fateful to Zhao. Then for the first time his hard heart was swallowed up by enormous tenderness. And now, looking at sleeping Ning, he most of all wanted to be with her always. The man dreamed of possessing her. But I didn't want to lose it forever. Therefore, I was ready to wait for her as long as necessary. Finally, a beautiful summer morning arrived. Xiao Lu and the sleepy Ning got out of the car. The girl was embarrassed. She looked at the man and saw that he seemed to have become something else. Something subtly changed in his gaze. Ning decided to ask him what happened. However, he remained silent and moved towards the house. She had no choice but to follow him. Suddenly, on the lawn in front of the house, they saw Lu Jingli lying down. He slept sweetly and had a wonderful dream. In it, he ran along the beach with a cute girl. Xiao Lu walked up to him and lightly kicked him in the side with the toe of his boot. Jingli stirred and muttered inaudibly something about stolen swimming trunks. It seems that the beach from the dream was all too real. Finally, he woke up and whimpered pitifully. Lu Jingli had clearly had a difficult night. Suddenly, he hugged Ning's leg and began to sob. Through sobs, the young man muttered that the windows in the car were too dark, and he could not see anything. Jingli also said that the car was completely motionless and calm. It seemed that this surprised him very much, because he was expecting another brother. Then Ning asked in surprise what he meant, and he explained that Xiao Lu said that he would be with her all night, and it is not surprising that the young man made certain conclusions. Hearing all this, Xiao Lu was completely dissatisfied, but he only restrainedly asked his brother not to talk about other people's personal lives, and not to be so interested in it. Lu Jingli jumped up and saluted playfully. Despite his comical appearance, he quite seriously promised that this would not happen again. It was clear that his brother's opinion was important to him. Afterwards, Xiao Lu took Ning into the house to show her the room he had prepared for her. The girl stood stunned on the threshold, pressing her hand to her lips. Of course, even before the renovation, the room looked quite decent. It was fully furnished and contained everything you needed. However, the room looked completely featureless. Now it was a sweet, cozy boudoir of a young woman. The walls were painted a lovely blue, and the shelves, pillows, and picture on the wall resembled pink marshmallows. Ning was amazed. She hesitantly addressed the man, calling him Mr. Lu. However, he gently asked her to be a little simpler. This made the girl somewhat nervous. She still felt that her stay in this luxurious mansion was a little unnecessary, and the renovations done for her sake discouraged her even more, which she told Xiao Lu about. And he calmly explained that she saved his precious son Xiao Bao, and the child really needs it in the future, so this would be the best option. And before she had time to agree with this, he looked at her slyly. Xiao Lu asked if she wanted his gratitude to be a little different. Ning just waved her hands in fear. She hastened to answer that she liked everything. The girl didn't even want to think about what else this extraordinary person could come up with. And Xiao Lu nodded understandingly and suggested that she first have a good rest in her new room. He clearly wanted Ning to settle down as soon as possible. The girl followed his advice. After closing the door, a minute later, she relaxed and stretched out on the bed and began to think. There were too many thoughts, but still she came to one thing. Ning understood that she could not be as weak and stupid as she was 5 years ago. The girl stood up decisively and sat down at the table. She opened her laptop and went online. She entered her password and checked her correspondence. Some of the messages made Ning a little sad. She tiredly leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Ning thought that now she absolutely did not want to do anything either for herself or for anyone else. Her relaxed rest was interrupted by the sound of her phone vibrating on the table. The name of Zhang, her sister and part-time producer, appeared on the screen. Ning answered the call excitedly. She was already accustomed to the fact that nothing good could be expected from Zhang's calls. And her premonition did not deceive her. The producer said that if Ning did not show up for filming by 9 o'clock, she would be fired. Ning hastened to assure that it will definitely happen. She hung up and thought. The girl did not understand what had happened. It seems that her character was not replaced, and the role still belonged to Ning. Ning now looked very touching and defenseless. She stood in the middle of the room, dressed only in a thin, short peignoir that revealed her long, slender legs. In order to somehow understand the situation, she decided to clarify everything. The girl dialed Chief Director Guo Dao's number to ask him. She hastened to apologize for the early call. However, the director was not surprised and predicted her question himself. He understood that Ning knew that they wanted to replace her. The girl said excitedly that this worries her most now, and she thought to herself that the director's friendly tone gave her some hope. Meanwhile, he said that investor Ning Dong was really looking for a replacement for her. After all, I thought that this role might be too difficult for a beginner. Hearing this, Ning frowned. She thought angrily that the investor should not judge this without knowing her abilities. But Guo Dao continued that she was still lucky. After all, the other investor did not see anyone else in this role, so it was not filmed. Ning smiled happily. She asked the director again whether she should be afraid of being replaced in the future. And he confirmed it again. He said that the main investor put 50 million into the picture. This was the largest investment, so his opinion became decisive. Ning was surprised. She had not previously heard of anyone else investing in this film. The news about a new major investor came as a complete surprise to her. And Guo Dao just laughed cheerfully and said that she shouldn't worry about it. Actresses shouldn't have thought about money. He ended the conversation in very high spirits. He, as a director, was quite satisfied with Ningxi's performance, and the additional huge investment was just a nice bonus. And Ningxi, having hung up the phone, jumped up and down with joy. She was really happy to hear such wonderful news. Then the door to her room suddenly opened. Xiao Bao stood on the threshold. He rubbed his sleepy eyes and looked at the girl in surprise. Ning picked him up and hugged him close. She kissed him on the cheek and cheerfully said that the baby had become a lucky talisman for her. Meanwhile, a happy smile appeared on the face of Xiao Lu, who was standing outside the door. He thought that Ning was now in his debt, but he wasn't going to ever tell her about it. After all, he had already seen her happy smile, and he didn't need anything more. And Ning had already seen him and hastened to share the good news. She said that the investor liked her, so she was no longer in danger of being replaced. Xiao Lu smiled and replied that this was indeed very good news. At that moment, he was admiring a girl who simply radiated happiness. And Ning said thoughtfully that the director, unfortunately, did not tell her the name of the main investor, and she would really like to know. The girl dreamily said that it seemed to her that this man must be very good-looking and have excellent taste. Xiao Lu looked at her with interest. And suddenly Ning froze, stunned. It occurred to her that she would be on set all the time. And then it became completely unclear what to do with Xiao Bao. The kid heard this and also froze in surprise. He looked confused and worried. However, within a minute, Xiao Bao noticeably cheered up. He grabbed a pencil and began to hastily write something in a large notebook. Having finished, he turned the notebook towards Ning and raised it higher. There was only one word written there: "Fight!" Ning hugged him and gently pressed him to her. She thanked the baby and called him her angel. And Xiao Lu looked at them and dreamily thought that everything could be so good. He definitely liked imagining their small family: himself, Ningxi, and Xiao Bao. The next morning, filming continued as usual. They filmed a large crowd scene in an ancient city. The director looked through the camera lens at the actors portraying the emperor and his retinue. Ning, in full makeup and costume, stood modestly behind. Guo Dao was quite pleased with how she handled the role. For a beginner, the girl performed very well. He looked into the camera and saw that Ning knew the words perfectly and knew how to present himself. The director thought that the main investor had come in handy, otherwise they could have lost a good actress. And Ning at this time was exhausted from the heat. She felt like she was simply melting in the spotlight in her many lush clothes. The girl began to quietly fan herself with her hand. However, she saw that Shui Luo, wearing the same fluffy heavy suit, seemed to be feeling quite well and was only drinking a little more water. Then Ning also hurried to pull herself together. She smiled calmly and straightened her back proudly. The girl swore to herself that now she would not show her weakness to anyone. And Guo Dao watched her efforts with satisfaction. He smiled calmly, and he reflected that he seemed to have found a new potential star. And then a girl assistant appeared on the site. She apologized for the intrusion and said that her boyfriend had come to see one of the actresses. Soon Su Yang appeared at the door. Shui Luo beamed and happily rushed towards him, and the assistants began to whisper. Many of them considered Xu Yan to be vicious and cruel. Zui Luo walked up to him and put her hands on her chest. She looked at the guy pleadingly and was clearly excited about something. Yan asked in surprise what happened. Then Shui Luo told him that her father and Ningxi had an unpleasant conversation at dinner yesterday. They quarreled. Ning Yao was furious and even planned to take Ning's role away. This interested Yan. He would give a lot to find out why Ningxi angered his father so much. Yan glanced over his shoulder at the imperturbable Ning. She calmly repeated the role and did not even look in their direction. Then Yan asked Shui Luo why Ning was still on the site, and she told him that someone unknown suddenly invested 50 million in the painting. This man is the largest shareholder, and his condition was a role for Ning. Su Yang frowned. He knew that Ning Shi was somehow behind this. However, there was no way she had that much money. And then the voice of an assistant was heard on the site. He shouted into the megaphone that someone was looking for Ning Shi. After his words, several couriers appeared at the door. Each of them carried in their hands a huge bouquet of luxurious scarlet roses, which literally filled the site. Ning Shi unfolded the card attached to the bouquets. After reading the text, she frowned with displeasure. The note contained only a few words. Someone who wished to remain anonymous reminded him that he should be met at the airport. Following this, another courier appeared. The tall young man was wearing a uniform apron and cap and was holding a small box in his hands. Ning Shi froze in fear when she saw him. She felt that the worst was yet to come. She signed the delivery papers and took the box. After hesitating a little, the girl finally opened it. On a blue velvet pillow lay an elegant ring with a huge sparkling diamond. Attached to it was a note with the initials US. Holding the open box in her hands, Ning sank exhaustedly onto a chair. She thought doomedly that the past had caught up with her again, and this time, it seemed, she would not be able to hide. Meanwhile, Shui Luo was talking with Su Yang. She asked him in fear what these flowers and the ring were connected with, and the young man replied that these were just random fans of Ning. To this, Shui Luo noticed that these fans turned out to be too rich and somehow appeared at the right time. After all, Ning just needed support, and Ning had already called someone. She quietly but passionately said into the phone that there was no point in trying to distract her on the set, and her invisible interlocutor once again reminded her that she must remember to pick him up at the airport. But this only caused Ning to have a new outburst of anger. She threw the phone away and now stood, breathing deeply and trying to come to her senses. And then the girl was informed that someone was looking for her again. People began whispering behind her back, discussing the incredible number of fans of the young actress. Someone even said that Ning is very suitable for the role of a cunning intriguer. And then a sweet young girl approached her, holding a small basket in her hands. She timidly asked if everything was okay. Ning assured her that everything was fine. But then she asked what the stranger needed and why the girl was looking for her. And she opened the basket and took out a small box of ice. There were several cans in it. The girl said they contained orange and watermelon juice, as well as bean soup. She added that the juice was personally prepared by the young master, who is very fond of making it. Ning Shi asked again in bewilderment. She didn't understand who they were talking about. And only then, looking closer, Ning noticed that each jar had a label with a wish of good luck and a small drawn heart. The handwriting on the cards was strangely familiar to her. The girl who brought the basket confirmed her assumption. And so it was. The author of the unexpected surprise was Xiao Bao. Ning pressed the can of watermelon juice to her cheek and seemed to feel all the love and care that the little boy put into her. She thought again how dear he had become to her during this time. The girl remembered his happy eyes and realized that from now on she would always and everywhere take care of him and fight for him. After all, he also showed so much warmth and care. The next morning was sunny, warm and beautiful. The sun-drenched mansion of the Liu family seemed to shine in the sun, surrounded by green trees. On the low table lay a mobile phone with a large screen. Suddenly it vibrated with an incoming message. Xiao Lu looked at the screen and opened the message. A happy smile lit up his face. He handed the phone to little Xiao Bao. Seeing his surprise, his father said that Ning Shi had sent the message to him. The kid took the phone and looked at the screen. At first he didn't understand anything, but then he read the message to the end. His face immediately lit up with a happy smile and his eyes shone. Now at first glance it was clear how happy this little boy was. Xiao Lu said to his son a little reproachfully that this was just a short message, although he was still pleased to see the child so happy. And then Lu Jingli appeared at the door. He flew in like a shining blonde whirlwind and immediately infected those around him with his energy. Seeing the message from Ning, Jingli winked slyly at Xiao Bao and showed him a heart made from his fingers. However, at the same time, the young man continued to look slyly at Xiao Lu. The man was a little embarrassed. To hide this, he asked his brother with feigned severity why he was not at work yet. And then Lu Jingli tried to become serious. He told Xiao Lu that he had important news that he must tell. The man calmly prepared to listen to him. It was as if he did not believe that his frivolous brother could report something truly serious. Jingli then said that he went to the set yesterday to watch the filming, and there he saw Ningxi being presented with a diamond ring and many flowers. Xiao Lu became gloomy and thoughtful. He asked his brother if he knew who the unexpected donor was. However, Jingli could not say anything about it. No one on the site knew who the flowers and ring were from. Then Xiao Lu picked up the phone and called his detective Chen Fang. The man instructed him to gather information about Ningxi recently. Hearing this, Lu Jingli put his hand on his brother's shoulder, wanting to stop him. He reminded Xiao Lu that Ning's past could be quite controversial and advised against giving the detective all the information. However, Xiao Lu angrily threw his hand away. The man believed that he had the right to know everything about Ning's past and present, because he already considered her his. A little later, Ningxi was sitting at the table in her parents' house. She sadly scrolled through her phone feed, looking at messages and news. Su Yang decided to talk to her. He was haunted by the gifts Ning had received the day before during filming. The young man wanted to know what Ning was doing while she was away. But the girl answered indifferently that all this did not concern him at all. She didn't consider Su Yang close enough to discuss this, and he conciliatorily suggested that she not quarrel, so as not to regret it later. Yan's intentions seemed completely harmless, but Ningxi had no intention of forgetting anything. She remembered what Su Yan and her sister did to her, and now she even liked to keep them in suspense. Then Yan decided to directly ask Ning how she got such a significant role in the new film. He could no longer contain his irritation and anger, but Ning had no intention of showing her cards. She decided to torment her ex-fiancé a little with riddles. This just infuriated Yan. He almost shouted that Ning should not have been here, should not have become an actress, and certainly should not have competed with Shui Luo, and this only seemed to amuse the girl. She, smiling, took a sip from a tall glass and said that for some reason Yan did not look like himself. He was behaving so strangely. Then he came to his senses a little and calmed down. Su Yang said that even though they broke up, he still cares about her and wants to help. These words of his completely shocked Ning with their cynicism. She felt anger and irritation overcome her. The girl said that she really needed his help, and she invited Yan to tell the truth about how Shui Luo treated her. Hearing this, Yan took her hand, but Ning pulled hers away. She turned around and headed for the exit, trembling with anger. As she left, Ning thought that someday she might forgive Su Yang. But this obviously won't happen soon. Ningxi was annoyed. However, as soon as she entered the gates of Lu's mansion, everything changed. But she just picked up Xiao Bao, who rushed towards her. He was the best medicine for her. The girl hugged him and covered the child's cheeks with kisses, and he laughed so happily and cheerfully that not a single heart could resist. Xiao Lu watched this touching scene from his window, and although it was extremely pleasant to look at these two, he was still a little jealous of Ning. Walking into her room, Ning decided to rest a little and unfastened her bra clasp on her back. In such heat, any extra piece of fabric caused suffering, and suddenly the door creaked quietly. The girl jerked in fright but did not have time to go to the bathroom. She saw the door slowly open, and Xiao Lu appeared on the threshold. Ning blushed with embarrassment. He had already stepped forward to enter, and Ning was still trying to quietly pull out her bra from under her t-shirt. And only then Xiao Lu noticed something and decided to turn away. He coughed in embarrassment and asked Ning's forgiveness for the intrusion, and the girl couldn't even answer him right away. She, sitting on the bed, was still struggling with the stubborn linen, puffing from the tension. Finally, she managed to get rid of the stubborn underwear. Ning sighed with relief and told Xiao Lu that she had recklessly not locked the door herself. Then the man asked why she came back so late. He suggested that Ning might have a date, and although it did not come easy to him, he still decided to ask directly. To this, the girl answered him displeasedly that she had simply met someone who annoyed her greatly. According to her, it was only a short conversation. Xiao Lu listened to her very carefully, and he watched her expression even more carefully. And I realized with relief that they definitely weren't talking about a date in that tone. He found out everything he wanted and decided to leave. Finally, the man reminded Ning not to forget to eat, because dinner had been left for her. Xiao Lu left, closing the door tightly behind him, and Ning went to the shower with relief. 15 minutes after a refreshing shower, she already felt like a new person. Her whole body sang with lightness and pleasure. The girl sat down on the sofa, placing her laptop on her knees. She decided to go online to check the news. After reading the headlines, She realized that so far the journalists had been quite loyal to her. Although they were interested in the mysterious gift and the many roses delivered to the studio, however, Ning understood that if the journalists wanted, they could start looking for the sender of the gifts, and this was undesirable for her. At the same time, Ning understood that all this could happen later. The gifts simply speeded up the discussion process. But it was inevitable, because actresses are always in full view of the entire crowd. Thinking, Ning sat on the sofa with her laptop on her lap. And then the door to her room opened again. Xiao Lu stood on the threshold again. This time he handed her a glass of milk because Ning never came out for dinner. The girl looked at him in surprise, and he explained that he had brought her a glass of skim milk because that's what she drank. Ning Shi looked at him gratefully. She was very pleased with this manifestation of care, because she didn't even remember when someone did something like that for her. But Xiao Lu still didn't leave, as if something was holding him. Now he asked Ning if she needed anything. Then the girl asked if he was going to do everything for her, even the smallest little things. It was nice, but it didn't fit in with his appearance as a tough boss. And at first he didn't even understand why she was asking. And he seemed to consider it quite normal to care so much about her and her desires. Then Ning laughed and said that he was showing such concern for her. She even felt as if her own sister was caring for her. This made Xiao Lu think. He wondered if he had gone too far with his participation. After all, he clearly did not want Ning to perceive him as a relative. But he still asked the girl if everything was fine with her, if she was happy with everything. And Ning answered him that now she is simply happy. And looking at her, Xiao Lu believed her words. He saw that the girl was calm and that her eyes were shining with joy. She was completely different from the girl he saw in the cramped closet. The man looked at her admiringly. He thought that he would do anything, but in the future he will definitely marry her. Morning has come. The Lu family's mansion still rose on the sun-drenched lawn, rushing into the blue sky. Xiao Lu was sitting at the table in his office. Thinking, he drummed his fingers on the table. Thinking about something of his own, he slowly said into the phone that he had already checked the set. Xiao Lu wanted to take care of Ning even in this. And Lu Jingli, with whom he talked, believed that his brother was taking on too much. And there is nothing wrong with the fact that a girl will have to face difficulties on her way to fame. But the big boss did not agree with this at all. He believed that his beloved woman did not need unnecessary trials and difficulties. And in order to slightly discourage his brother from following and finding out everything, Xiao Lu said that he was giving Jingli a week of vacation. Even his eyes lit up with happiness, dancing on the spot with joy. The young man said that he would still find someone who would keep an eye on the development of events. Jingli was very interested in his brother's hobby. Then there was a knock on the office door. The maid informed Xiao Lu that Dr. Qin had arrived. Entering the office, he said that he was just passing by and decided to visit for a while. Dr. Qin said that he passed by the kitchen and saw Xiao Bao making juice. He asked Xiao Lu how long ago the kid had such a hobby. The man invited him to sit down and talk about it. Dr. Qin noticed that little Xiao Bao's mood had improved significantly, and he would like to know what led to this. And the doctor was quite surprised when he noticed Xiao Lu's embarrassment. Previously, he had never seen at least some manifestation of the feelings of the imperturbable boss. He thought, trying to analyze the situation and its possible development. Changes in the father's life could significantly affect the baby's behavior. Finally, Dr. Qin said that he had always believed that some serious hobby or new activity could greatly help Xiao Bao's condition. The new affection could also be beneficial. He asked if Xiao Lu had hired a nanny or a new teacher for the baby. But the father replied that he would entrust the child only to the one who could replace his mother. The doctor was surprised. He asked the man if he was thinking about a new relationship. After all, a new mother for a child could also become a wife for Xiao Lu. And he thoughtfully said that the doctor seemed to be right. His dreamy appearance was quite unusual for a man of his mentality and character. Dr. Qin even clapped his hands with joy. He was very glad to hear that a little more warmth and love could appear in this family. Unable to restrain himself, he began to bombard Xiao Lu with questions. The doctor was interested in absolutely everything, whether it was love or passion or just infatuation. The man was even taken aback by such pressure. But after thinking, he still agreed with the doctor. And he said that it is impossible to be happy without drinking the cup of pleasure to the bottom. Xiao Lu agreed with this. He said quietly that he was working on this, and he tries very hard. The doctor was very happy to hear this. He guessed that a girl who could attract the attention of such a person must be a certain special person, and Dr. Chin was going to give Xiaolu some advice about courting girls. And he thought that this obsessive desire from all sides was already beginning to irritate. Meanwhile, the girls on the set decided to gossip a little. Someone asked if it was true that Ning had to become intimate with someone in the group for the role. Xue Luo answered very evasively that she had not witnessed it, but she could not deny it. Although she immediately came to her senses and said that she personally found it very difficult to believe it. The girls chatted so much that the director even noticed it. Angry, he shouted into a megaphone for them to shut up and get to work. Then Xue Luo finally walked into her dressing room. She sat in front of a large mirror looking at her reflection, while the makeup artist fluttered around. Soon the door opened quietly. Xue Luo turned around interestedly and saw Ning Shi enter. She was calm and calm. Ning just silently looked at the girls and walked to her usual place. Xue Luo said sarcastically that she seemed to see the first beauty of the set in front of her, and probably the makeup artists are simply fighting for the right to serve her. But Ning did not answer anything, but only silently pushed back her chair and sat down. She decided not to react in any way to Xue Luo's attacks, so as not to get nervous and quarrel. Xue Luo couldn't bear this at all. In a rage, she threw the comb on the floor so hard that it shattered into pieces. The girl screamed that she would not allow anyone to ignore her. She shouted that because of Ning, the opinion of her had already changed for the worse. Xue Luo was looking for something heavier with her hands to throw at Ning. After all, her sister's equanimity irritated her incredibly. At that moment, she looked like a furious fury, and Ning just sat calmly in her place. Moreover, she even began to whistle quietly. Then an assistant looked through the slightly opened door. She told Xue Luo that they were already waiting for her. She finally gritted her teeth in anger and once again looked angrily at Ning. It seemed that Xue Luo couldn't figure out how to hurt her sister, but Ning Shi confidently controlled herself. She only glanced sideways at Xue Luo, but still continued to remain silent. Finally, Xue Luo came out with her head raised arrogantly. Ning stopped whistling and sighed in relief. When Xue Luo came out, she saw a girl makeup artist. She greeted her and said that she was very glad to see her. Xue Luo asked what happened to her. She saw that the girl seemed preoccupied with something and looked different from her usual self. And she answered excitedly that she was a little worried. After all, she didn't know that Ning Shi was allergic to metal, so she put powder in a metal jar on her table. But Ning Shi had already spoken to the makeup artist. The girl waited until the makeup artist was free, and with a smile took out a small box from her purse. Handing it to makeup artist Amy, Ning asked her to use her own makeup for the makeup. She explained this by saying that her skin is quite sensitive and bad cosmetics can cause harm. The makeup artist reluctantly agreed. However, she hastened to warn the actress that if difficulties arise because of this, then Ning will bear responsibility. Naturally, Ning Shi agreed with this. And now I didn't have to worry about the quality of my makeup and the reaction of my skin. As she expected, the makeup came out great. Still, professionals worked at the studio. Ning was very pleased and looked great. However, after the makeup artist left, Ning had one more thing to do. She walked over to a long rack of clothes for filming and looked at it anxiously. If someone walked into the dressing room now, they would be very surprised. After all, Ning Shi, the leading actress of the film, walked around the racks of costumes, passing a powerful magnet over them. She carefully checked every wrinkle on all the many outfits. It took quite a long time but was worth it. In fact, Ning was afraid that she would find a tiny needle in the folds of her clothes, which would cause severe pain. This is exactly the technique that many actresses often used. You could also find needles or metal shavings in shoes. Ning also thought that Xue Luo could easily replace her cosmetics, knowing about the metal allergy. The girl remembered the situation she had been in for many years due to the fault of Xue Luo. She knew her sister's worth and knew what she was capable of. Therefore, I tried to remember all the tricks. Filming finally began. On this day, they were filming a scene with the Emperor and the heroine Ning. The girl was gorgeous and looked great in this role. The director was very pleased with her performance and how they matched with the actor who played the Emperor. Guo Dao never tired of praising the girl, and even clapped his hands with delight. And Xue Luo also continuously watched Ning Shi, but her interest was caused by completely different reasons. She wanted to see how Ning would suffer from poor quality cosmetics. However, time passed and nothing happened. The makeup artist did not even show that she understood what was going on. She also saw that there was no allergic reaction. Angry, Shueluo started shouting at the makeup artist. She didn't understand how it could be that nothing appeared on Ning's arms, legs, or face. The girl was furious. She could already imagine Ningxi's suffering and looked forward to that joyful moment when her main rival would not be able to continue filming. Meanwhile, director Guo Dao, pleased, walked up to Ning to praise her again. He liked everything, but he asked Ning not to slow down and continue to play just as well. He also told her that a new actor would be joining the team next month. He was supposed to become another partner for Ning, and the director expected the same success from their performance. This news interested Ning. She began to ask Guo Dao who this new partner would be, but he decided to keep the intrigue and not give away the secret for now. The director only mysteriously said that he was an excellent actor and a good person. Then the inspired Ning picked up his game and began asking leading questions. First, she asked if the man was handsome. The director answered in the affirmative. Then Ning decided to find out if he was tall. The smiling director also agreed with this. This game made Ning laugh merrily. She thanked Guo Dao for choosing only very attractive actors for her. She was definitely pleased with it. While Ningxi was having this light, cheerful conversation with the director, Xue Luo was secretly watching them. She had heard about the new actor and was now wondering who it could be. Ning returned to the Lu family mansion late in the evening. In the light of the lights, the house was even more beautiful. Spacious, but cozy. It beckoned into its warmth. Entering the house, the girl stretched sweetly. In a very short time, this mansion had already become something familiar and close to her. She gained a sense of home and family. Ning didn't even immediately notice Xiao Lu sitting in a chair by the fireplace, and he turned to her and offered to go eat at a newly opened restaurant with Xiao Bao. However, the girl was forced to refuse. She explained that she had to go to the airport to meet someone, and I was going to return very late. Xiao Lu closed the newspaper sadly. He noticed that if Ning was not there, then little Xiao Bao would not want to go anywhere without her. Then Ning cheerfully remarked that she would have to postpone this trip until next time. She didn't seem to think much of it at all. And Xiao Lu slowly asked her who she was going to meet. He was primarily interested in whether it was a man or a woman. Ning hesitated. She didn't plan to explain anything to Xiao Lu. At least she wasn't going to do it right now. And this question seemed a little strange to her. She remained silent, and then hastily noted that it was already late. Walking up the stairs, Ning said that it was time for her to leave if she didn't want to be late. After getting ready, she went to Xiao Bao to kiss him goodnight. She said that she needed to go away for a while, and asked him to go to bed and obey his father. Now her light heels were clicking along the path, moving away from the house, and Xiao Lu looked after her sadly and puzzled. He was thinking intensely about something. Very soon, Ning arrived at the airport building. The huge building was flooded with lights and seemed to cut through the darkness of the night. And in the black sky above him, planes scurried with sparkling sparks. An endless crowd had already gathered inside the building. Looking closely, one could see that there were only young women there. And they all shouted only one name, Jiang Muye. And suddenly the crowd screamed furiously. The reason for their insanity was a tall, fair-haired young man in a cap and dark glasses. He had just appeared in the aisle, accompanied by a group of men in dark suits and sunglasses. One of them was carrying a jacket behind him, and the other was rolling a bulky suitcase. The boy star pulled his glasses down a little on the tip of his nose and winked playfully at the crowd. He shouted that he greeted everyone and was glad to see everyone. The girls screamed even louder. They shouted that they loved him and that he was the best for them. Ningxi watched the madness of the crowd in the distance. She thought that Jiang Muye must be grossly overestimating her if she thought she could take him away in front of that crowd. Luckily, she had expected something like this and had done some preparation. Ning disappeared into the toilet and opened her bag. She waved her puff a few times, put on a gray wig and a plain brown jacket. A moment later, a harmless, touching old woman looked at her from the mirror. She took out her phone and began typing a message. Ning wrote to Jiang Muye that she would be there soon and would meet him. However, a response message immediately came from him. In it, he wrote that he would give her no more than 5 minutes. Otherwise, he threatened to tell everyone about their relationship. Seeing this, Ning quickly jumped out of the toilet and rushed into the hall. There she began to squeeze through the crowd of fans, asking to be allowed to look at the star. At first, the girls made an indignant noise, but when they saw the old woman, they calmed down. Granny looked so sweet and pleasant that she did not come across as a threat. Some of them stepped aside to let her go ahead. and Ning, in the guise of an old woman, began to loudly tell how she liked Zhang Muye. According to her, he was too similar to her grandson. At this point, Zhang himself became interested in the nimble granny. He took a closer look at her, and something in her image seemed strangely familiar to him. Meanwhile, shouts of approval were heard from the crowd. It seems that everyone was delighted with the 80-year-old woman who was not afraid to come to the airport on a hot day because of the star. Zhang Muye didn't understand what was happening. He hadn't had a grandmother for a long time, so it was strange to hear that he looked like someone's grandson. And then suddenly that same cheerful old woman threw herself on his chest with joyful cries. She screamed that she was very happy to see her beloved grandson, and that she missed him very much. Then Zhang Muye thought of taking off his sunglasses and took a closer look. And suddenly Grandma winked at him playfully. Only at that moment did he suddenly understand everything. A triumphant grin appeared on his lips. He chuckled and leaned towards the imaginary old woman's ear. Zhang Muye quietly asked if she was expecting him this evening. His assistant instantly assessed the situation and shielded the guy and his granny from the crowd. The man loudly announced that he was asking everyone to disperse, because the old woman was too weak and would have to be escorted home. Hearing this, Zhang Muye finally turned to the fans and sent them a charming smile. Meanwhile, he took the old woman in the other direction, putting his arm around her shoulders. A few minutes later, a black minibus was already rushing through the streets of the night city. He was taking a TV star from the airport, accompanied by a strange old woman. In the car, Ning still continued to play the role of a loving granny. She looked at the road and asked if her grandson remembered the address of his home, and although there was only the driver in the car besides them, Ning seemed not to want to leave the image, and this irritated Zhang Muye quite a bit. He turned to the imaginary granny and irritably asked not to call him his grandson. His tone was almost threatening, and Ning bowed to him mockingly, offering a mock duel. Her fists seemed to itch in anticipation of a fight, and then Zhang Muye jumped into the back seat next to her. A minute later, the driver watched with boundless amazement a desperate fight in the rearview mirror. In a continuous tangle of two intertwined bodies, it was impossible to make out who had the upper hand. But the driver heard Zhang Muye piteously asking him not to hit him in the face. He shouted that he would be shooting an ad for a fashion magazine cover this month. And now the driver also began to fear for the star's appearance. Suddenly, Zhang Muye cried out in a puzzled manner. He asked Ning where she got what she now had in her hands. After all, it was prohibited. In a very pitiful voice, he asked to be let go. And the driver was already very interested in finding out what was the matter. But he couldn't see anything in the mirror. Ning, meanwhile, dreamily said that she bought it in a special store, and the price was considerable, as much as 9,000. And Zhang Muye whimpered and moaned pitifully. Finally, the driver turned his head slightly and saw the reason for his whining. The star's left hand was handcuffed to the headrest. It was these that Zhang did not expect to see at Ning's, and she continued to tease him as if mocking him. Suddenly, the girl froze warily. She noticed that the road along which the car was moving seemed strangely familiar to her. Ning turned to Zhang Muye questioningly. She clarified whether his villa was located in the most prestigious quarter of the city. He confirmed this with some surprise. The guy had already calmed down a little and even wanted to hug his imaginary granny. He said that although he was a little late with this, he was still very glad to meet him. And Ning drove along familiar streets, inexorably approaching the block where the Liu family's mansion was located. And for some reason she had a bad feeling. Finally, the car stopped in front of a huge mansion. It was as luxurious as Xiao Lu's mansion, but it looked much more pretentious. The driver and part-time assistant Zhang Muye reminded him that it was too late. The star had too many plans for these days, and he shouldn't get out of schedule. However, Zhang did not want to hear anything. He demanded that Ning stay with him that evening because a very important duel awaited them. He walked up to Ning and extended his hand to her playful gray wig. Zhang demanded that she finally get rid of this fancy dress, because her eyes could not deceive anyone anyway. He pulled a strand and tore off the curly wig. Ning didn't expect this, but she quickly pulled herself together and even asked if she looked good now. Meanwhile, he had already approached the music center and began choosing music. Zhang said over his shoulder to Ning that his room was full of clothes and she could change there. The girl went upstairs and Zhang began to hum cheerfully. He was in a great mood because everything was going as well as possible. The young man had already made a playlist and turned it up louder. Suddenly, there was an unexpected knock on the door. He turned around, puzzled. Zhang was not expecting anyone else this evening. Approaching the door, he pressed the intercom button, and he grimaced with displeasure when he saw Xiao Lu's face on the screen. It was very strange that the man decided to pay a visit so late. However, it was still him. Xiao Lu stood in front of the door, not yet having time to remove his hand from the bell button. And his face was not too happy either. Zhang Muye finally opened the door and invited Xiao Lu to come in. However, anyone would have noticed that he was not at all happy about the uninvited guest. They walked into the room and Xiao Lu calmly sat down on the sofa. He seemed not to notice at all the inhospitable mood of the owner of the house and was not going to leave. Then Zhang Muye hesitantly said that he was a little busy. Seeing that Xiao Lu did not understand, he explained that he was not alone at the moment. However, the man did not understand him at all as he should have. Xiao Lu calmly replied that he could very well wait a little while for Zhang Muye to be free. He caught himself and handed Zhang Muye a small box tied with a ribbon. The man said that his mother conveyed this to the star with warm wishes. And then, like a bolt from a clear sky, a loud voice sounded from above. It was Ning Shi who asked Zhang Muye what kind of clothes she should take if all the clothes had too large necklines. Xiao Lu turned his head in amazement when he heard her voice. He would have expected to see anyone but Ning Shi in the house of screen star Zhang Muye. However, it was her. It was Ning who was now walking down the stairs from the second floor, dissatisfied and wearing a dress that was too short with a strange cutout on the side. And Ning suddenly saw him too. The girl stopped in shock, her mouth open in surprise. She couldn't understand how Xiao Lu ended up in this house. Zhang Muye held the box in his hands and tried to smile casually. But I only thought that Ning should wait a little and not go out right now. It seemed that this was exactly what each of the three was thinking about now. At least none of the faces showed any signs of joy from the unexpected meeting. But it was already too late. The girl walked down the stairs and was now standing in front of the seated Xiao Lu. They looked at each other point blank, and their gazes were very reminiscent of two crossed blades. Meanwhile, Zhang Muye finally decided to introduce the guests to each other. She told Ning that in front of her was the president of the Lu Corporation, Xiao Lu, who knew how to arrive at the wrong time. And Ning's head was already racing with hundreds of questions. She could not even imagine that these two not only lived nearby, but also would know each other. To this, Xiao Lu said with barely restrained rage that Ning had not told him anything about who she was supposed to meet. And it was also news to him that it turned out to be Zhang Muye. He looked carefully at the girl and asked how she knew the screen star. Ning was silent, trying to choose her words carefully. Suddenly she ran up to Zhang Muye and started shaking him. Ning loudly asked him how he knew Xiao Lu and why he didn't tell her anything earlier. The young man, who did not expect such pressure, muttered under his breath that no one had asked him anything, and he only told Xiao Lu that he had a sister, but did not go into details. Xiao Lu himself was only watching Ning and Zhang Muye at this time. Using all his intuition, he tried to understand what the nature of their relationship really was. Finally, he got tired of it all. The man stood up and asked Ning if she wanted to stay or return home with him. She was silent, breathing heavily, and Zhang Muye looked dumbfounded, first at her, then at Xiao Lu. He tried to understand how it happened that they not only knew each other, but also seemed to live together. Ning was as if between two fires. She stood between two men who were as different as ice is from fire, and had to make a choice. And she made a decision. The girl turned to Zhang Muye and quietly said that she promised to return. But now she had to go, and the young man in response tried to grab her hand. He said offendedly that she should not leave because she promised to spend the whole evening with him. But Ning Li waved it off and asked him not to worry and not to insist. She was already mentally rushing to where her home had been recently. The girl headed towards the exit, holding only her bag in her hands, which contained ridiculous old lady clothes and a gray wig. She took with her only what she came with. Xiao Lu silently followed her, and from his imperturbable face it was absolutely impossible to understand what he thought about this whole situation. And Zhang Muye stood and just sadly looked after them. He was only wondering if Ning had taken all her things. After all, if she forgot something, she could very well return. Very soon, Ning and Xiao Lu arrived at the Lu family's mansion. Looking at the house, Ning once again thought that it was very similar to its owner, just as calm and reserved. She immediately went up to Xiao Bao's room to greet him. The baby was already lying in his crib, covered with a cute soft blanket with stars. He looked at her happily with already sleepy eyes, and Ning said that she would like to go to bed next to him tonight. The baby jumped up joyfully and began clapping his hands on the bed, inviting Ning to sit next to him. She smiled happily, looking at him, and thought that he always saves her from sadness. Ning was so tired that she couldn't even find the strength to undress. She sat upright on the edge of the bed in a light skirt and blouse. The girl lay down and a happy Xiao Bao sat next to her, resting his head on her shoulder. She wished the boy sweet dreams and closed her eyes tiredly. Already falling asleep, Ning thought that this day was too exciting for her. Her heart was still fluttering with excitement. The house gradually fell asleep. However, the desk lamp was still burning in Xiao Lu's office. It seemed that the man was not going to go to bed. He was sitting at his desk and thinking hard about something. The ashtray in front of him was already full of cigarette butts. Xiao Lu thought that he now understood why his detective could not find out anything about who sent Ning gifts for filming. Finally, he decided to go on vacation. But before that, I wanted to check how my son was doing. Xiao Lu walked to the boys' room and turned the doorknob. Inside, a very warm and touching picture was revealed to his eyes. The two people dearest to him were sleeping sweetly in an embrace, clinging tightly to each other. In a fit of unexpected tenderness, Xiao Lu walked to the bed and threw back the blanket. He carefully, so as not to wake her, put his arm around the girl's shoulders and lifted her into his arms. He carried her along the corridor, trying to step as quietly as possible. But he didn't need to worry. The girl was still sleeping peacefully. Xiao Lu brought her to his room. It was bright and cozy, but it was a little unusual to see that on one side there was a desk and cabinets with papers, and on the other there was a soft bed. It was on her that the man carefully lowered the sleeping Ning. Covering her with a blanket, he carefully looked at her face, trying not to wake her. But the girl was fast asleep. Then Xiao Lu sat on the chair next to the bed and lightly stroked her cheek. He kept thinking about why Ning was at Zhang Muye's house today. Lost in his thoughts, the man involuntarily took a strand of her hair in his hands and inhaled the aroma. It was very thin and light, but it seriously excited him. Leaning very close to her face, Xiao Lu heard Ning's breathing, closing his eyes dreamily. The room was illuminated only by the moonlight from the window. He thought that this girl was even more beautiful than the moon. Unable to restrain himself, Xiao Lu leaned down and lightly touched her lips with his lips. This was what he wanted more than anything in the world for many days and nights. Suddenly, Ning raised her hand and sharply pushed the man away. He thought that she had woken up. However, upon closer inspection, I realized that she was still fast asleep. The girl turned over on her side and snored quietly, hugging the pillow. If she suddenly woke up and opened her eyes now, she could see something completely unusual. Xiao Lu, always so reserved and even cold, looked at her with such love. But then morning came. Ning woke up and sat up in bed. She stretched sweetly and opened her eyes. However, she immediately froze in surprise. The girl tried to understand how she, who fell asleep in Xiao Bao's crib, ended up in his father's bed. But nothing came to mind. Without solving this riddle, Ning began to get ready for work. Soon she was fully dressed and had even packed her bag. Before leaving, the girl decided to go in and say goodbye to Xiao Lu. She found him calmly drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. However, today he seemed a little different to her for some reason. Ning looked at him and thought that she had become too attached to him and his son lately. And now she was beginning to fear that the man would somehow disappoint her. Suddenly the girl felt that someone was pulling her by the hem of her dress. Looking down, she saw little Xiao Bao. He looked at her anxiously, not letting go of the dress. Ning knelt down in front of him and took his hands. The child was clearly very upset about something. She began to ask him what happened and why he looked so unhappy. But the boy, as always, was silent. And then Ning heard the calm voice of his father. Xiao Lu said that she forgot to say goodbye to the child and kiss him. Ning even slapped her forehead in frustration. She didn't understand how she could forget about this. The girl hugged the boy tightly and pressed him to her. Kissing his forehead, she asked for forgiveness and said that she had to go to work. Hearing this, the baby calmed down a little but still looked upset. He looked after Ningxi as she left for a long time. When the slender figure was out of sight, the boy finally turned to his father. His face was again dissatisfied, and above his head he raised a sign on which he wrote that his father was a thief. Xiao Lu was puzzled. He did not understand what the boy wrote about and asked again. The father wanted to know what his son thought he stole, and he was already writing something on the next piece of paper. When he showed it, Xiao Lu couldn't help but smile. The kid wrote that last night his father stole Ning from him. Seeing that he was smiling, the boy became angrier. Now he wrote that Ning belonged to him, and decisively pointed this note at his father. Then his father smiled reservedly and a little sadly at him. Xiao Lu said that Ning is 19 years older than the boy, and it's unlikely that she will wait that long for him to grow up. Seeing that this made the child almost cry, Xiao Lu patted his head. He said soothingly that he hoped Ning would become his wife, and therefore, a mother for Xiao Bao. Hearing this, the boy shone brighter than the sun. His father had not seen him so happy for a long time. A little later, some very interesting conversations could be heard on the set. Shui Luo was talking to one of the costume designers named Qing Qing, and they discussed Ning Shi again. The girls were clearly sure that she was constantly twirling men, using them to her advantage. Qing Qing claimed that she would never have agreed to the role that Ning was offered. Then the main director Guo Dao appeared on the set. He walked in and waved his hand to everyone. It was clear that he was in a wonderful mood, and soon the reason became clear to everyone. Guo Dao announced that the main supporting actor, a fine actor and singer, had finally arrived, and he was going to present it to everyone right now. Ning Shi rushed towards the director with interest. She couldn't wait to finally meet her new partner. After all, it was her heroine that he should have paired with. She looked intensely at the door, and suddenly her eyes widened in surprise. At first, Ning noticed the surprisingly familiar blonde hair. Their owner bowed his head low, but she already understood who she was about to see. The girl groaned in disappointment. She didn't understand why this particular person had to become the main supporting actor and her partner. Zui Luo, noticing her reaction, raised her eyebrows in surprise. She even opened her mouth about to say something. Suddenly, her friend and main gossip comrade Qing Qing screamed with delight. She screamed that she was happy to see Zhang Muye in front of her. Shui Luo turned around. And it really was him. A blonde young man stood at the door, casually taking off his sunglasses. And the cries of delight did not subside all around. Only Ning Shi was not at all delighted with what she saw. She muttered in shock that he should never have been her partner on the set. And Shui Luo was now simply beside herself with anger. She didn't understand why Ning Shi was so lucky. After all, Zhang Muye was originally supposed to become her partner. And now she was forced to watch Ning cheerfully talking with the director. Shui Luo felt that everything was passing her by, both the fame from the role she received and the famous Zhang Muye. Meanwhile, the director approached the star actor and said that he expected a lot from his performance with his partner. Guo Dao was sure that they looked great together. Zhang Muye replied that he was very glad to get a calm partner. After all, almost the girls that he met only wanted intimacy from him and were not interested in work. The director hastened to reassure him, saying that the heroine is the beautiful warrior Meng Zhang. He was sure that she would not let anyone near Zhang Muye, and the director waved his hand to Ning Shi, who was standing in the distance. He finally decided to introduce him and the star to each other. Zhang Muye began to take a closer look, and then to his great surprise he noticed Ning Shi approaching them. The girl approached, her heels clicking loudly, but he could not recover from the shock. Once there, she extended her hand and introduced herself. Seeing Zhang Muye's confusion, Ning said that she was honored to play with the star. The young man was discouraged. However, he politely extended his hand in return and also greeted his beautiful partner. After shaking hands, he still looked away in embarrassment. And in a dull voice, he said that he was very surprised that it turned out to be her. Guo Dao stared at him in amazement. Stuttering, he nevertheless asked if they knew each other. Zhang Muye replied that he met Ning Shi on another set when she played a character named Bluebird. Guo Dao nodded in understanding, and Ning, smiling shyly, said that then her role was too insignificant. There she just demonstrated the perfect martial arts that Zhang Muye remembered so much. The delighted director quickly said that he was very glad that they knew each other. After all, now the actors won't have to get used to each other for a long time. He even hoped that on the same day they would be able to begin filming very spectacular romantic scenes. Ning was confused. This wasn't exactly what she wanted. And Guo Dao thought about something and suddenly snapped his fingers with joy. He suggested that we begin filming the 37th scene. Ning froze in place, dumbfounded. She remembered that in this scene her character Meng Zhang was openly flirting with Sun Yuqing, Zhang Muye's character. The director began to explain the content of the scene to the actors. They immediately became serious and listened with increasing attention. And he said that the character Meng Zhang is a real devil in human form. She flutters all over the city and knows what is happening in every nook and cranny of it. Guo Dao enthusiastically said that at the age of 16, Meng Zhang met Sun Yuqing on the street and fell in love with him. Since then, she began to monitor him daily. Ning listened to him and thought. She was worried that she didn't quite understand Sun Yuqing's character. For her, he was a closed book, sometimes strong, sometimes weak. The director noted that he specifically decided to start filming with this scene. After all, she will be able to immediately show whether the actors are suitable for each other on screen. Ning shared her doubts with him, but Guo Dao replied that she herself must think over a line of conduct for her heroine. An hour later, the actors finally changed clothes and put on makeup. The first to enter the stage was Ning Shi as Meng Zhang. She was dressed in a scarlet suit with lapels, slightly reminiscent of a man's suit. Zhang Muye appeared behind her in the guise of Sun Yuqing. An enthusiastic whisper was heard on the site. The young man was wearing a long kimono robe with a snow-white cape. He approached Ning and asked what she thought of his image. Zhang Muye thought that he looked more like a beautiful girl than a courageous hero. But Ning Shi did not fuel his vanity. She said that the young man looked quite normal. Seeing Zhang Muye's dissatisfied grimace, the girl added that her partner is famous for the fact that he loves to draw all the attention to himself. But she was not going to give in to him in anything. Oddly enough, this statement only provoked the screen star. He believed that conquering such a wayward beauty would be even more interesting. Therefore, when Ning left the platform and walked along the corridor, the young man did not hesitate to rush after her. He walked very fast, and it looked like Zhang was chasing her. Meanwhile, in one of the dressing rooms, Shui Luo was calming the upset and offended Qing Qing. She convinced her that Zhang Muye just wanted to have fun with Ning, but the costume designer was still very angry. Clutching a tailor's knife in her hand, she angrily said that she would try very hard to make Ning's costumes as uncomfortable as possible. Shui Luo heard this and grinned maliciously. She thought that she wouldn't even have to do anything herself. Her revenge would overtake Ning in the form of an offended dresser. To film the next scene, the hero Zhang Muye had to be tied to the bed with thick ropes. The director even hastened to apologize to him for the inevitable discomfort, but the young man stretched out freely on the bed, although he was tied by his arms and legs. He said lightheartedly that filming was the main thing for him. Therefore, I was ready to endure the inconvenience. Filming has begun. The heroine, Ning, Meng Zhang, was sitting on the edge of the bed next to the tied handsome man. She calmly asked the young man whether he had thought well about her proposal, and he could only clench his fists in impotent anger. Sun Yuqing told her that she still didn't understand anything. After all, she couldn't easily intimidate him by behaving dishonestly and unworthily. But the insidious beauty reminded him that he was too young, had no family and no children. This means that he will not be able to resist, and sooner or later will not be able to resist her. Sun just turned away and said that his ancestors, of course, would not see this, but he will never be able to forget and betray the honor of his family and get carried away by it. Then the girl began to gently and affectionately persuade him. She used all her charms, promising to obey him in everything and always be there. All he had to do was agree to become her husband. She reached out her hand and began to gently stroke his face. Sun Yuqing grimaced with displeasure. Holding on with all his strength, he asked her not to talk nonsense. However, Meng Zhang moved very close. She noticed that he blushed slightly and decided that he liked her too. The girl reached out to his face and, almost touching her lips, spoke. She said that they would be very good together. Finally, the director announced a freeze frame. He was beaming with joy and thought that everything had turned out just fine. Ning Shi immediately jumped out of bed and walked to the far corner of the site. And Zhang Muye wiped his forehead with relief and began to rub his wrists, which were aching from the ropes. Ning picked up her phone to check her email. At this time, he rang as if on order. The girl was surprised to see that Lu Jingli was calling her. This was strange because the frivolous brother Xiao Lu had no reason to do this. She sat down straight on the floor and answered the call. Ning immediately asked him to speak quickly because she had very little time. Lu Jingli just greeted her, and she already realized that something was wrong. The girl asked him in fear what happened, and then Jingli began yelling into the phone that something had happened to him and his brother. According to him, Xiao Lu has been unusually gloomy all day, and he leads a meeting that has been going on for 12 hours. Ning tried to answer that it wasn't about her at all. She assumed that Xiao Lu's dissatisfaction was only related to the business, where cases had accumulated during his vacation. However, Lu Jingli firmly replied that he knew his brother too well, and he is absolutely sure that his bad mood is connected only with Ning Shi. The girl indignantly replied that she had done nothing, and I thought to myself that I had just left for the airport late in the evening. And then she walked around half naked in someone else's house. And now Lu Jingli was simply hysterical. He demanded that Ning do something about it. After all, he didn't want to lose his job at all. The young man also said that the meeting was so difficult that one of the leading financiers even became very ill and had to see doctors. Looking at her phone, Ning saw that Lu Jingli had sent her a photo. It showed a pale man in a suit lying on a gurney being loaded into an ambulance. He also sent another photo. Ning saw a very gloomy and dissatisfied Xiao Lu sitting at a large table. In his sharp suit, he seemed to radiate coldness even through the screen. The girl enlarged the photo with her fingers to get a better look at his face. Indeed, he was very gloomy. But she also saw sadness on his face. Ning Shi was clutching the phone in her hand and thinking hard. She should have found a way out and figured out how to calm Xiao Lu down and bring back his good mood. She also didn't want anyone else to get hurt because of her. And then a wonderful thought came into the girl's head. She figured out how she could help everyone. At this time, the entire office froze in fear and tense anticipation. Frightened financiers sat at a long table. At the head of it was Xiao Lu's chair. It was as if darkness emanated from him. And then suddenly the phone lying right in front of him rang. The piercing sounds made those present tremble tensely. Xiao Lu picked up the phone and asked the caller to call him back. After all, he was in a meeting that should not have been interrupted. However, somehow the phone turned on speakerphone by itself, and everyone around heard a ringing voice. He asked if Xiao Lu was busy. The men at the table looked at each other in amazement. They were completely unprepared to hear a young female voice. This didn't sound like their boss at all. At the same time, Lu Jingli was bursting into tears in the far corner of the office. It was literally littered with piles of papers that refused to shrink, and he was really looking forward to Ning Shi. But Xiao Lu still answered the call. He turned off the speakerphone and brought the phone to his ear. Moving a little to the side, the man asked what happened. From his cold voice, the girl was overcome with a strong attack of panic. It seemed to her that she was going of her own free will straight into the mouth of a lion. However, she calmly asked if Xiao Lu would return home that evening. Ning reminded them that they had promised Xiao Bao that they would go out and have dinner together. The man responded rather coldly that he was busy right now and couldn't talk. He also wasn't sure he could return. His words caused Lu Jingli to cry again. The young man felt that his end was near because even Ning Shi was useless. Meanwhile, she continued to persuade Xiao Lu. The girl explained that she didn't know the baby's taste and might not please him if they went out to dinner together. She literally demanded consent from her boss, and he listened to her in silence, but his face seemed to come to life a little and warm up. Finally, he firmly promised that he would return soon. These words pleasantly struck everyone present. Lu Jingli even folded his hands in prayer and thanked God for this girl. It was as if angelic singing began to sound in his head. Now he believed that he was already saved and the danger was over. Everyone around noticed that Xiao Lu's phone rang after Lu Jingli asked someone for something. So now he walked around with his nose literally in the air with pride. All the financiers present at the terrible meeting believed that the solution had been found perfectly. And Lu Jingli importantly repeated that he could not always do everything alone. Meanwhile, on the set, after finishing her conversation with Xiao Lu, Ning Shi also breathed a sigh of relief. She was glad that everything was finally okay. She was just able to relax when suddenly a familiar voice was heard behind her. It was Jiang Muye who asked what she was doing alone. He also invited her to have dinner together. Hearing this, Ning jerked in fear. Turning around, she invited him to eat alone since she simply could not go. However, Jiang Muye did not count on refusal at all. He asked offendedly how she could deny her friend a regular dinner. Since Ning was silent, he continued to ask what things could be more important than dinner, and with whom she was going to spend the evening. The girl replied rather sharply that this did not concern him. Then Jiang looked at her sadly, and Ning even noticed a small tear in the corner of his eye. He asked if she was going to meet Xiao Lu. The girl turned away. She didn't want to explain anything at all, but she still said that it was so. Her answer literally drove Jiang Muye crazy. He began to rush around, shouting that Xiao Lu was a dangerous person, and she was playing with fire by communicating with him. To this, Ning answered irritably that she herself understood everything perfectly well. She was already starting to get tired of this conversation and the hysteria of the screen star, and he suddenly calmly asked to tell him what was going on with them. His mood changed instantly, and Ning decided that he had a right to know. She rubbed her forehead tiredly and said that it all started when she saved Xiao Bao. This made Zhang Muye quite excited. He began bombarding her with questions. Then Ning had to tell him the whole story from beginning to end. After listening to her, the young man said that all this was a strange coincidence of circumstances. He began to convince her that she didn't know Xiao Lu at all, and he can't even imagine how many women want to get him into their networks and join the family. Finally, Zhang Muye mentioned that her eyes were still simply closed due to the fact that their relationship was not even a month old, and she doesn't understand at all what it means to enter the Lu family. Ning was unpleasant to hear this. However, she immediately remembered Xiao Bao and smiled again. She cheerfully said that she really wanted to go back to Lu's house to see this little treasure. Hearing this, the young man even gritted his teeth in frustration. He angrily said that it was better for her not to even become attached to the boy. After all, children are not at all as simple as she thinks. This amused Ning greatly. She simply asked what he might know about children. After all, the screen star Zhang Muye had neither a family nor children. He just grinned wryly at this. And I decided to use my last trump card. Jiang assumed that this was Ning's way of leaving the Ning family and finding a new home to start over. However, it didn't work. The girl ignored his last phrase, but she said she had a few questions that he could answer. Zhang Muye felt like he was being pushed into a corner. He didn't let Ning leave when she wanted him to. Now he couldn't leave on his own. So he sighed and agreed to answer. And she asked a very unusual question. Ning knew that Xiao Lu only had a younger brother, Lu Jingli, and she wanted to know what, in this case, connected him with Zhang Muye, who behaved like a relative. To this, the young man replied that he and Xiao Lu were not related at all. But since their families have known each other for a very long time, and his friendship with Xiao Lu has also been for many years, he is used to calling him brother. Apparently, this answer did not satisfy Ningxi at all, because within a minute she had already grabbed Zhang Muye by the collar and pulled hard. The girl shook him with all her might and continued to ask. She definitely needed to know why he decided to get the role of Sun Yuqing. After all, Ning no longer believed in such coincidences. From such pressure, the young man was completely at a loss. Holding his forehead with his hands on which a huge lump swelled, he whimpered and moaned. Zhang Muye justified himself that he just liked the role, but Ning continued to give him very painful blows. She muttered angrily that she was not at all happy about this partnership, and tried to take out all her irritation on the guy. Finally, she was a little exhausted. Calming down, Ning threw him aside and said that there was nothing more to talk about. It was time for her to leave, and Zhang Muye, exhausted and offended, remained sitting on the floor. He sadly looked after her and thought that he did not understand women at all. Suddenly, completely inappropriately, costume designer Qing Qing quietly approached him. She smiled playfully and offered to join him for dinner. She even supposedly knew a great place. However, Zhang stretched tiredly and answered dissatisfiedly that he was too tired that day to go anywhere. But I thought to myself that even if I went, it would definitely not be with Qing Qing. The girl was upset. Nevertheless, she still tried to hold the star, grabbing his sleeve. Qing Qing said that it would be nice to celebrate the first day of working as a team, but Zhang Muye waved her off again, this time rather rudely, and he unfriendlily said that he was not going to celebrate anything. Finally, he asked the girl not to disturb him anymore. His words were quite ordinary, but his eyes flashed lightning. It seemed that now he could even hit or push the annoying beauty. Director Guo Dao came in handy here. He explained to Qing Qing that the actor was indeed very tired today, so he would celebrate another time. The girl sighed in disappointment. This didn't suit her at all, but she couldn't do anything. However, Qing Qing was greatly offended by the fact that Zhang Muye spent the whole day with Ningxi, but did not want to be with her. The poor little costume designer had long been extremely envious of Ningxi. She believed that Ning was just a successful, arrogant upstart. Therefore, Qing Qing resigned herself this time, but harbored a grudge. She was sure that someday she would still have the opportunity to take revenge on Ning. And Ning fortunately did not suspect anything about this. She drove home impatiently, slightly worried. Upon entering the house, she immediately loudly told Xiao Bao that she was already home. The girl saw with emotion that the baby was sitting at a table in the living room. He was clearly waiting for her. Ning entered the room and came closer. She was a little worried that the child did not rush towards her, as was usually the case. However, she soon realized the reason for his behavior. He was sitting on a chair and holding a large glass of milk filled to the brim with both hands. The kid was simply afraid of spilling it, so he didn't get up. Ning took the glass from his hands and felt that the milk was still quite hot. She was very touched by his concern, so she said that it was very nice and added that she loved him very much. After drinking the milk, the girl squatted down in front of Xiao Bao, and in a conspiratorial voice suggested going to his room. She wanted to pick out some nice clothes for him to go out to dinner. The kid was delighted with this idea. Upon reaching the top, Ning immediately began rummaging through the closet, looking for something special for him. However, everything seemed too boring to her, but she finally found something she really liked. It was very bold and unusual, but very sweet. When the baby changed his clothes, it was impossible to look at him without smiling in tenderness. He was wearing dark blue overalls and a bright orange t-shirt, but the main decoration was the bunny's hat. Ning also chose a very similar outfit for herself, a blue jumpsuit with a pink hoodie. But naturally, her head was also decorated with cute bunny ears. Xiao Bao was happy. Not only did he really like the costume itself, most of all, he was happy that now he and Ning were very similar. Meanwhile, Xiao Lu had also already returned home. He was waiting downstairs, dressed in his expensive formal office suit with vest and tie. Hearing footsteps, the man raised his head. His eyes widened in surprise. He seemed completely speechless. He stood there, petrified, while Ning and Xiao Bao walked towards him holding hands. And Ning Shi just told him that they should buy more cute clothes for the baby in the future. They stood looking into each other's eyes, and each of them thought that it seemed that their future would be common, and very, very happy. After all, Ning Shi and Xiao Lu already had a wonderful baby.